My name is Julia, and at 33 years old, I never expected a simple piece of paper to expose the ugly truth about my family. At our annual Christmas dinner, my grandmother handed each of us a check for $8 million. Everyone burst out laughing. My father sneered that it was fake and told her not to be an idiot as he ripped it into pieces. I silently tucked mine away. The next morning at the bank, the manager pulled me into his private office with a pale face and whispered that we needed to talk. Before I share exactly how my family lost millions in a single night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a massive estate in Connecticut meant that our holidays were less about warmth and more about displaying wealth. The dining room table was set with fine china crystal glasses and a massive floral centerpiece that my mother Catherine probably paid thousands of dollars to arrange. The room smelled of roasted duck and expensive wine, but the atmosphere was suffocating and cold. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table wearing a simple black dress I had bought on sale. I was a financial auditor for a nonprofit organization, a career choice my family viewed with absolute disdain. Across from me sat my younger sister Courtney. She was 30 years old and dripping in diamonds that her wealthy surgeon husband had just bought her. Courtney spent the entire first course complaining about the contractors renovating her summer home, whining that good help was impossible to find, and making sure everyone knew exactly how much the renovations cost. Next to her was my older brother Gavin, the golden child of the family. He served as the vice president of sales at my father's corporate logistics firm. Gavin was loud and arrogant, constantly checking his phone and bragging about the leased luxury sports car parked in the driveway. He dominated the conversation, talking over everyone to boast about his commissions. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard, dictating the flow of the room with his usual commanding presence. He considered my career a waste of talent and a stain on the family legacy. To him, human worth was measured entirely by income brackets and luxury zip codes. And then there was my grandmother, Beatrice. She sat quietly beside me, eating her meal without saying a word. Everyone assumed she had been completely broke since my grandfather died 15 years ago. She lived in a modest condo, took the city bus to get around, and wore the same wool coat every winter. My parents treated her like a burden, a charity case they only tolerated because it looked good for their social image to host the elderly matriarch for the holidays. The dinner conversation was moving exactly as it always did. Gavin boasted about a recent account he closed, claiming he was single-handedly keeping the logistics firm at the top of the market. My mother nodded along, soaking up his arrogance and praising his business acumen. Whenever I tried to speak about my own life or the audits I was running for local charities, my father would cut me off or completely change the subject. He made it perfectly clear that my life choices were not worth discussing at his table. Dessert had just been served when the energy in the room suddenly shifted. Beatrice reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out 4 crisp white envelopes. She placed them on the table with a quiet dignity that seemed completely out of place in this room of loud, boastful people. She slid one envelope toward my father, one toward Gavin, one toward Courtney, and the last one toward me. She said she had a special Christmas gift for each of us this year and asked us to open them together. My mother immediately rolled her eyes and took a large sip of her wine, making a soft, scoffing sound. My father sighed heavily, acting as though he was humoring a difficult toddler. He picked up the envelope with an exaggerated display of exhaustion and tore it open. I watched his face closely as he pulled out the slip of paper. For a split second, his expression was completely blank. Then his face contorted into a look of absolute disgust. He dropped the paper onto the table like it was toxic. Gavin and Courtney opened theirs next. Courtney let out a sharp, loud laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of the dining room. Gavin picked up his piece of paper and waved it around, smirking at his sister. It was a personal bank check. I opened my envelope slowly and pulled out the identical slip of paper. My breath caught in my throat and my heart started pounding against my ribs. Written clearly across the check in bold black ink was the amount of $8 million. The signature at the bottom belonged to Beatrice. The room erupted into cruel, dismissive laughter. My father's face turned red with anger. He glared at Beatrice and slammed his hand on the table, making the expensive silverware rattle against the plates. He said this was a senile delusion that was completely ruining the holiday dinner. He told his own mother that she was embarrassing herself and reminded her cruelly that she barely had enough money in her checking account to pay for her bus fare. Without another word, my father grabbed the $8 million check, ripped it into shreds, and tossed the pieces onto his empty dessert plate. Gavin and Courtney immediately followed his lead, eager to participate in the mockery. Courtney giggled hysterically as she tore her check right down the middle. She looked at our mother and said they should frame the scraps to show the doctors how far gone the old woman really was. Gavin shredded his check into tiny pieces of confetti and sprinkled them over his wine glass. He joked loudly that he could use the $8 million to finally pay off his bar tab and upgrade his country club membership. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my family brutally mock an elderly woman who sat silently taking their abuse. The cruelty of the moment was staggering. Beatrice did not cry or argue or try to defend herself. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, watching them destroy the checks. I looked down at the piece of paper in my own hands. I did not know if it was real or simply a product of dementia, but I knew I would never participate in their vicious game. I quietly folded the check in half and slid it into my purse, wanting to preserve whatever dignity my grandmother had left. My mother, Catherine, saw me put the check away, and her face twisted into a nasty sneer. She pointed her manicured finger at me across the table, forcing everyone to look my way. She said I was always humoring the crazy and that my bleeding heart was my biggest flaw. She told the entire room that this pathetic behavior was exactly why I was a 33-year-old glorified bookkeeper struggling to pay rent. She raised her voice, ensuring her words cut as deep as possible. She said I lacked the killer instinct to succeed in the real world, while my brother was closing million-dollar accounts and living the life I was too weak to achieve. Her words were designed to humiliate me and remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. It was a swift, brutal reminder that they viewed my decision to work for a nonprofit and live independently as a massive failure. I was the family scapegoat, the designated punching bag they used to feel better about their own shallow lives. I absorbed the blow, keeping my face completely neutral and my posture straight. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry or get defensive. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and looked my mother directly in the eye without saying a single word. The rest of the dinner was an absolute nightmare of passive-aggressive comments and forced smiles. My father complained bitterly about the cost of the meal and the incompetence of his staff, while Gavin bragged about his upcoming ski trip to the Swiss Alps. Courtney spent the next hour ignoring Beatrice entirely, acting as though the elderly woman sitting right next to her was completely invisible. They drank expensive wine and talked about themselves, oblivious to the silent tension radiating from my side of the table. When the miserable evening finally came to an end, I walked out to the hallway to help Beatrice put on her heavy winter coat. The rest of the family remained in the living room, loudly discussing their New Year plans and pouring more drinks. As I carefully buttoned her coat to keep the winter chill out, Beatrice reached over and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong and urgent. I looked down at her, expecting to see confusion or sadness in her eyes after the terrible way she had just been treated. Instead, her gaze was razor-sharp, highly focused, and completely lucid. There was absolutely no trace of dementia or confusion in her expression. She pulled me down slightly so she could speak directly into my ear, ensuring that the family in the other room could not hear us over their own loud voices. Her tone was quiet, but carried an intense, serious weight that sent a cold chill racing down my spine. She looked right into my eyes and told me to deposit the check at 9 in the morning sharp. She warned me not to be late. The morning air in Connecticut was bitter cold, biting fiercely through my thin wool coat as I scraped a thick layer of frost off the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan. My phone vibrated violently against the passenger seat. It was a text from Gavin demanding a temporary $2,000 loan to cover his luxury car lease. He completely missed the staggering irony of begging his glorified bookkeeper sister for cash mere hours after ripping up an $8 million check like it was worthless trash. I tossed the phone into the center console and ignored the message. I pulled into the sprawling parking lot of the First National Bank at exactly 8:55. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car, staring at the folded piece of expensive paper in my hand. It felt utterly ridiculous. I was holding an $8 million personal check from a woman who aggressively clipped grocery coupons and took the city bus to her medical appointments. My father's mocking, cruel laughter echoed relentlessly in my head, telling me I was an absolute idiot for humoring a senile old woman. But the sharp, completely lucid look Beatrice had given me last night anchored me to this moment. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, right as the grandfather clock in the lobby struck 9. The bank lobby was quiet, mostly filled with local small business owners making their routine morning deposits. The smell of stale coffee and floor wax hung heavily in the air. I stepped up to an available teller, a young man who greeted me with a polite, indifferent smile. I handed over my debit card and the folded check. I asked him to deposit it into my checking account, trying desperately to keep my voice steady and professional. He unfolded the thick paper, and his fingers paused immediately. He looked at the astronomical amount, then looked up at me with a deeply strained expression. I braced myself for the laughter I was so used to getting from my arrogant family. Instead, he typed a rapid sequence into his computer keyboard. I watched the reflection on his monitor carefully. The screen suddenly flashed a bright, glaring red. A massive warning prompt popped up covering his entire display. The teller swallowed hard and pressed a concealed button under his desk. He told me to please wait exactly where I was, his voice shaking slightly. Within seconds, 2 armed security guards approached my station from across the lobby. The heavy, crushing dread of public humiliation washed over me. Richard was going to have an absolute field day with this incident. My father would probably frame the police report just to prove to his wealthy friends how gullible and desperate his middle child truly was. The guards did not grab me, but their stance was rigid and highly intimidating. They asked me to step away from the counter and follow them immediately. The entire lobby went dead silent as customers turned to stare at the commotion. I kept my chin up, refusing to look like a criminal, while my heart hammered relentlessly against my ribs. They escorted me down a long carpeted hallway and into a large glass-walled office at the far back of the branch. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, leaving me completely alone in the quiet, sterile space. I sat in an oversized leather chair, sweating uncomfortably under my heavy winter coat. I mentally prepared my best defense. I was a respected financial auditor for a nonprofit organization. I had a spotless, clean record. I would just calmly explain to the police that my elderly grandmother was suffering from severe dementia, and I was simply humoring her to keep the peace at a highly toxic family dinner. 5 agonizing minutes passed. I checked my phone screen. Another aggressive text from Gavin calling me selfish for ignoring his financial demands. Another text from my mother Catherine complaining that I had left my cheap scarf in her pristine marble hallway, ruining her aesthetic. They never stopped taking. The glass office door swung open with a sudden whoosh. A man in his late 50s wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit walked in quickly. His polished name tag identified him as Mr. Harrison, the regional manager of the bank. He was holding my specific check and a remarkably thick manila folder. He looked extremely pale, almost physically ill. He immediately closed the heavy blinds on the glass walls, shutting out the curious view of the lobby. I immediately started speaking fast, telling him I was so sorry and that I knew the check was a massive mistake. I explained my grandmother lived on a strict fixed income and did not know what she was doing. I told him I just wanted my debit card back, so I could leave and forget this ever happened. Mr. Harrison held up his hand, stopping my frantic explanation in its tracks. He sat down heavily behind his large mahogany desk and placed the check carefully on the green blotter. He looked at me with an expression of profound respect that I had never once received from anyone in my own family. He said there was no mistake. He told me the check was entirely valid and backed by fully verified liquid assets. I stared at him, completely unable to process the words coming out of his mouth. I asked him how that was logically possible. I reminded him that Beatrice lived in a tiny, run-down condo and took the public bus everywhere she went. Mr. Harrison gave a small, tight smile that held years of guarded secrets. He explained that Beatrice was the silent majority shareholder of a massive international holdings trust. He told me she controlled vast assets across 3 different continents, including prime commercial real estate portfolios, international shipping conglomerates, and highly lucrative tech investments. The elderly woman, my parents constantly treated like a pathetic charity case, was actually one of the wealthiest private individuals in the entire state. I sat totally paralyzed as the reality crashed down on my shoulders. My father Richard strutted around town like a king because he ran a moderately successful mid-sized logistics firm. My sister Courtney thought she was untouchable royalty just because her surgeon husband bought her expensive diamonds. They were absolute peasants compared to this hidden empire. Mr. Harrison typed his high-level authorization code into his secure laptop. He pressed a key with finality and looked up at me. He said the funds had just cleared. $8 million was sitting directly in my personal checking account. The room spun wildly around me. I was a 33-year-old nonprofit auditor who routinely budgeted her groceries down to the absolute last dollar. I was now a multi-millionaire in the blink of an eye. But Mr. Harrison was not finished with his revelations. He opened the heavy manila folder he had brought into the room with him. He pulled out a secondary sealed envelope made of thick parchment. It was heavy and felt significant. He slid it across the polished wood desk toward my trembling hands. He explained that Beatrice had given the bank very specific, rigid instructions regarding this exact account. She had fully anticipated my arrival this morning and demanded this be given only to me. I picked up the envelope carefully. It bore my full legal name in Beatrice's elegant flowing handwriting. I broke the red wax seal and tipped the contents onto the smooth desk surface. A heavy antique brass key clattered loudly against the wood, along with a dense, terrifyingly formal legal document printed on premium paper. I picked up the document, my professional instincts kicking in to ground me. The header clearly identified it as the execution protocols for the Beatrice Family Trust. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, but my extensive background in financial auditing allowed me to cut through the noise with ease. It was not just a simple generic inheritance form. It was a highly complex conditional framework designed to evaluate the beneficiaries. Mr. Harrison watched me read, his hands clasped tightly together, resting on his desk. The silence in the room was deafening as I scanned the paragraphs outlining asset distribution rules. He then asked me a question that instantly changed the trajectory of my entire life. He leaned forward, his face deadly serious, and his eyes locked onto mine. He asked me if the other 3 beneficiaries had deposited their specific checks yet. I looked up from the legal document, my mind racing backward. The chaotic memory of last night flashed vividly in my brain. I remembered Richard's red, furious face as he ripped the paper in half, calling it a senile delusion that ruined his holiday aesthetic. I remembered Courtney's hysterical, cruel giggling as she deliberately tore hers right down the middle, talking about framing the scraps. I remembered Gavin acting like an entitled fool, sprinkling the shredded paper confetti over his expensive wine glass, joking about paying his country club tabs with imaginary money. I looked Mr. Harrison dead in the eye, feeling a sudden surge of power. I told him they did not deposit them. I said they tore them up and threw them directly in the garbage. Mr. Harrison gasped sharply. The remaining color completely drained from his face. He stared at his computer screen, frantically verifying the strict trust parameters. He took a shaky, shallow breath and looked back at me with absolute awe. He told me that by depositing this check, I had just triggered the gratitude clause. I asked him what that meant, my voice a mere whisper. He pointed a trembling finger to the legal document in my hand. He said the checks were incredibly real, but they were also a strict behavioral test. by willfully destroying the financial instruments my father, brother, and sister had legally renounced their claims to the estate. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a harsh, heavy whisper. He said since they forfeited their shares, the trust dictates that the entire $32 million defaults to the sole remaining beneficiary. He said legally, I now owned it all. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. $32 million. The number echoed in the sterile glass office, bouncing off the walls like a physical weight. Mr. Harrison did not give me time to spiral into a panic attack. He stood up from his desk and gestured toward a discreet door at the back of his office. He told me the brass key I held was not for a metaphorical door. He instructed me to follow him and keep my questions until we reached the lower levels. I gripped the heavy brass key so tightly its jagged teeth dug into my palm. We walked through the private door and stepped into a secure elevator hidden away from the main bank traffic. Mr. Harrison inserted a special keycard and pressed the button for the subterranean levels. The descent was entirely silent. The air grew significantly cooler as we dropped below the bustling city streets. I watched the floor indicator light up, feeling like I was descending into a completely different reality. The woman who worried about the cost of heating her apartment was gone. In her place stood the sole heir to a staggering corporate empire. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime, revealing a stark white hallway lined with high-definition security cameras. At the end of the corridor stood a massive steel vault door. 2 armed guards flanked the entrance. Mr. Harrison provided his biometric scans, submitting his thumbprint and a retinal scan before the thick steel mechanisms loudly disengaged. The vault door swung open with a heavy mechanical groan, revealing rows upon rows of polished safety deposit boxes. Mr. Harrison led me down the third aisle, stopping in front of a large reinforced box numbered 808. He gestured to the brass key in my hand. He told me the box required dual authorization. He inserted his master key into the left lock and waited for me to insert mine into the right. We turned them simultaneously. The metal door clicked open. Inside was a sleek black metal lockbox. Mr. Harrison pulled it out and carried it to a private viewing room equipped with a single stainless steel table and harsh overhead lighting. He opened the black box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a silver flash drive and a thick stack of official legal documents bound by a heavy wax seal. The seal bore the exact same crest that Beatrice wore on her vintage signet ring. The ring my mother constantly mocked as cheap costume jewelry. Mr. Harrison carefully broke the seal and spread the documents across the table. He pointed directly to page 42. The heading was printed in bold black ink, stating it was the gratitude clause. I leaned over the metal table, reading the dense legal text. Beatrice had engineered a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Mr. Harrison explained that my grandmother knew exactly how cruel and arrogant her son and grandchildren were. She had spent 15 years watching them worship money while simultaneously treating her like garbage. She knew they valued appearance over substance. The gratitude clause was a legally binding behavioral test. It was drafted by top-tier international trust attorneys and designed to be completely airtight. The clause explicitly stated that the physical checks distributed on Christmas night were legal instruments of wealth transfer. They were genuine. However, the clause also contained a strict condition regarding acceptance. If a beneficiary willfully destroyed, defaced, or discarded their financial instrument, they were legally executing a voluntary renunciation of their entire inheritance. My father ripping his check in half was a legal forfeiture. Courtney tearing hers while laughing was a binding rejection of the funds. Gavin shredding his into confetti to mock a senior citizen was the ultimate renunciation of his birthright. Mr. Harrison pointed to a specific subclause at the bottom of the page. He explained the mechanism of default. Because Richard, Gavin, and Courtney had violently rejected their gifts, the trust was legally obligated to reallocate their forfeited shares. The money did not return to a general fund. It defaulted directly to the sole remaining beneficiary, who accepted the gift with grace. Because I folded my check and placed it in my purse, I passed the test. I was the only one who did not treat the gift with contempt. Therefore, the remaining $24 million automatically transferred to my designated account. Added to my original $8 million, I was now sitting on $32 million of liquid capital. I traced the words on the page, my vision blurring slightly. Beatrice had weaponized their own arrogance against them. She knew their massive egos would never allow them to accept a multi-million-dollar check from a woman they viewed as a senile burden. She knew they would destroy the checks to make a point to humiliate her and assert their dominance. They had literally ripped up their own financial salvation just to be cruel. I asked Mr. Harrison about the silver flash drive resting on the velvet. He looked at it with a mixture of respect and deep apprehension. He told me that Beatrice had spent the last decade quietly auditing my father's business practices. He said she knew Richard Logistics' firm was not the massive success he claimed it was. The flash drive contained encrypted corporate ledgers, offshore banking records, and highly sensitive financial data, proving exactly how my father funded his lavish lifestyle. Mr. Harrison warned me that once I plugged that drive into a computer, I would understand the full extent of the rot running through my family. Beatrice left it for me because she knew my background as a financial auditor made me the only person capable of understanding the numbers and executing the final phase of her plan. I reached out and picked up the cold silver flash drive. It felt like holding a loaded weapon. My mind raced with the implications. I was no longer the quiet, submissive daughter who took their abuse. I possessed their money, and I held their darkest secrets in the palm of my hand. I was untouchable. Before I could ask Mr. Harrison how to access the encrypted files, a sharp, loud buzzing shattered the quiet of the vault room. My phone was vibrating aggressively against the metal table where I had set down my purse. I stared at the screen. The caller ID flashed brightly, showing Courtney's name. I ignored it. I did not have the energy to listen to my sister complain about her contractors or demand I run errands for her. I turned back to the legal documents. The phone stopped buzzing for exactly 2 seconds before it started vibrating again. Then it rang a third time. Courtney never called me 3 times in a row unless she needed someone to blame for a massive inconvenience. Annoyed, I picked up the device and swiped to answer. I brought the phone to my ear, ready to deliver a sharp remark about being busy. I never got the chance to speak. Courtney was screaming on the other end of the line. Her voice was completely hysterical, stripped of all her usual polished pretension. She was crying so hard she was choking on her own words. The background noise was chaotic. I could hear medical machines beeping rapidly and people shouting urgent commands. I asked her what was wrong, my voice echoing loudly in the steel vault. Courtney sobbed uncontrollably, her words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. She screamed at me to get to the hospital immediately. She said they were rushing her into the intensive care unit and the doctors were saying it was catastrophic. I demanded she tell me who was in the hospital. Courtney gasped for air, her voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. She said it was Beatrice. She told me our grandmother had just collapsed on the kitchen floor from a massive stroke. My blood ran completely cold. The silver flash drive slipped from my fingers and hit the steel table with a sharp clink. A massive stroke. The words hit me with the force of a freight train. Just 12 hours ago, Beatrice was sitting next to me at the dining room table, executing the most brilliant financial maneuver I had ever witnessed. She was sharp-focused and entirely in control. Now she was fighting for her life in an emergency room, while the family she had just legally dismantled hovered around her. I demanded Courtney tell me exactly which hospital they were at. She shrieked the name of the private medical center downtown, the one our family always used because my father insisted on VIP treatment. She screamed at me to hurry, saying the doctors did not think Beatrice would make it through the afternoon. The line went dead with a harsh click. I stood frozen in the subterranean vault, the silence rushing back into the room. Mr. Harrison was watching me closely, having heard the sheer panic radiating from the phone speaker. He asked me if everything was all right, his professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine concern. I looked from his face down to the table. The gratitude clause was still spread out before me, a testament to a woman who had suffered years of emotional abuse, only to deliver the ultimate final judgment. The $32 million was safely secured in my name. The flash drive containing the tools to destroy my father's fake empire was waiting to be decrypted. Beatrice had given me everything I needed to wage a war I did not even know I was fighting. And now she was dying before I could even say thank you. I gathered the legal documents with swift, precise movements. I shoved the papers and the flash drive deep into my purse, locking them away. I looked at Mr. Harrison and told him my grandmother had just collapsed. I said I needed to leave right now. He nodded quickly, his expression grim. He told me the bank would secure the accounts and that I had his direct line for any immediate transfers I might require. He promised the assets were completely locked down and untouchable by anyone bearing the name Richard Gavin or Courtney. I sprinted out of the viewing room and back toward the elevator. My mind was a chaotic storm of grief and calculating logic. I knew exactly what was happening at that hospital. My family was not crying out of love for the woman who raised them. They were panicking because they suddenly had to deal with end-of-life care funeral costs and the public embarrassment of managing a relative they claimed was destitute. They had no idea the woman lying in the intensive care unit was a secret billionaire. They had no idea they had forfeited their entire future the night before, and most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that the quiet sister they relentlessly bullied was now holding the reins to their entire financial existence. I pushed through the bank lobby doors and ran out into the freezing Connecticut morning. The frost on my windshield had melted, but the coldness in my heart was just beginning to set. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I pulled out of the parking lot. The war had officially started. I pushed my foot down hard on the accelerator, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned bright white. The drive to the downtown medical center felt like a blur of gray concrete and flashing traffic lights. My mind was racing far faster than the tires on the asphalt. Just hours ago, my grandmother was sitting at a dining table executing a brilliant and ruthless financial strategy. Now she was fighting for her life. By the time I slammed my car into a parking spot and sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit, my lungs were burning. The sterile, overwhelming smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol hit me immediately. I navigated the maze of white corridors until I found my family huddled in the main waiting area. The scene was sickeningly predictable. They were not crying. They were not holding each other in grief. My mother, Catherine, was aggressively scrolling through her phone, loudly complaining to a nurse that the hospital reception was too weak to load her social media feeds. She was genuinely annoyed that her afternoon spa appointment had been interrupted by a family emergency. My father, Richard, was pacing back and forth near the vending machines, barking orders at his secretary over a wireless earpiece, demanding that his afternoon meetings be rescheduled without losing any major clients. Courtney was sitting in a plastic chair, picking at her expensive manicured nails, while my brother Gavin loudly complained about the exorbitant hospital parking fees. I walked right past them without offering a single glance or greeting. I marched straight to the nurse's station and demanded to see Beatrice. A young nurse gave me a deeply sympathetic look and guided me toward a private room at the very end of the hall. I stepped inside, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, blocking out the noise of my toxic family. Beatrice looked incredibly small and fragile, lying in the center of the hospital bed. She was surrounded by massive humming machines and tangles of clear plastic tubing. The heart monitor beeped in a slow, fading rhythm that echoed loudly in the quiet room. I walked over and took her cold, frail hand in mine. I leaned in close to her ear. I whispered that I had gone to the bank. I told her that I understood exactly what she had done and the sheer genius behind her plan. I promised her with every fiber of my being that I would finish exactly what she started and that they would never see a single dime. Her fingers twitched slightly against my palm. Her breathing slowed to a halt, and then the steady rhythmic beeping flatlined into a solid, continuous tone. The medical staff rushed into the room, but it was already over. Beatrice was gone. I stepped out of the room, feeling a heavy, hollow silence settle deep into my bones. I walked back down the corridor to the waiting area to break the news. Before I could even say the words, Richard took one look at the grim expression on my face and let out a long, heavy sigh of profound inconvenience. He did not shed a tear. He did not offer a moment of silence. Instead, he immediately turned to Catherine and started calculating the financial damage. He rubbed his temples and complained loudly that funerals were a massive drain on capital. He said burying his mother was going to put an unnecessary dent in his quarterly bonus and ruin his financial projections for the month. Catherine crossed her arms and completely agreed, stating they should just cremate her as quickly and cheaply as possible to be done with the entire ordeal. Gavin chimed in immediately, suggesting they list Beatrice's condo on the real estate market by tomorrow morning. He sneered that the rundown property might fetch just enough quick cash to cover a bargain bin casket and a cheap burial plot, so the expenses would not cut into their luxurious lifestyle. Courtney nodded eagerly, adding that they needed to clear out the condo this weekend so they could stage it for a quick cash sale. I stood there listening to my own flesh and blood plot to liquidate their dead mother's meager perceived assets just to save a few dollars. The sheer, unadulterated greed made my stomach turn. I did not argue with them. I did not yell. I just turned around and walked straight out of the hospital doors. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and dialed the private direct line Mr. Harrison had given me at the bank. I authorized a massive wire transfer to the most exclusive funeral director in the state. I told the director I wanted a service fit for absolute royalty and that money was absolutely no object. 4 days later, my family arrived at the historic basilica downtown, expecting a modest, depressing memorial service. Instead, they stepped into a cathedral completely transformed by extreme wealth. Thousands of rare imported white orchids cascaded down the ancient stone pillars and draped elegantly over the polished mahogany pews. A professional string quartet played a hauntingly beautiful symphony that echoed perfectly through the vaulted ceilings. At the front of the church rested a solid bronze casket flanked by towering massive arrangements of white roses and imported lilies. It was an event of staggering elegance and undeniable financial power. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping open as he took in the sheer opulence of the room. Catherine nervously clutched her designer handbag, looking around wildly as if she had accidentally walked into the wrong venue. They knew Beatrice had absolutely zero savings, and they knew they had explicitly refused to contribute a single dime to the arrangements. They spent the entire solemn service exchanging paranoid, suspicious glances and whispering furiously to each other in the front pew. I sat several rows back wearing a sharp, tailored black suit I had purchased the day before. I watched their confusion mount with a quiet, cold satisfaction. They were squirming in their seats, entirely unable to comprehend how this lavish tribute had been orchestrated, or who was footing the astronomical bill. The funeral reception was held in the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel directly across the street from the basilica. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated through the crowd, offering trays of expensive vintage champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. The tension radiating from my family was thick enough to cut with a knife. I watched Richard corner the funeral director near the entrance, demanding to know who signed the checks for the event. The director calmly cited strict client confidentiality and walked away, leaving my father fuming. I was standing near the large bay windows looking out at the gray city skyline when Gavin stomped heavily across the room toward me. His face was flushed dark red with anger, and he smelled heavily of expensive scotch. He shoved his index finger aggressively into my shoulder and demanded to know how I paid for all of this. He accused me of taking out massive, predatory loans just to show off and embarrass the family in front of their wealthy friends. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his breath hot against my face. He sneered that I was a complete financial disaster playing a game I could not afford. He said I was just as delusional as the dead old woman. He raised his voice, deliberately drawing the attention of nearby guests, and loudly reminded me that Richard had to bail me out of my crippling college debt just so I would not end up living on the street. I did not back away from him. I stood my ground and swatted his finger away from my shoulder with a sharp, swift motion. I looked at him with absolute disgust and decided I was completely done playing the submissive sister. I told him he needed to get his facts straight before he ever opened his mouth to me again. I stated loudly and clearly that Richard never paid a single cent toward my education. I told the surrounding guests that I worked 3 brutal jobs scrubbing floors and waitressing until 2 in the morning to pay off every single penny of my own tuition. I took a step closer, dropping my voice to a lethal, venomous whisper intended only for his ears. I told Gavin I knew exactly where Richard's secret corporate bailout money actually went. I said I knew Richard had to quietly liquidate $300,000 of company assets just to pay off Gavin's massive underground gambling debts to keep his legs from getting broken by bookies. I watched the arrogant, entitled smirk instantly vanish from my brother's face. The blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him pale and entirely speechless. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, looking around nervously to see if anyone else had overheard the dark truth he had tried to keep buried for years. Before Gavin could even attempt to recover from the shock, a sudden loud commotion near the ballroom entrance caught my attention. A man in a rumpled gray suit burst through the heavy double doors looking frantic and completely out of breath. It was my father, top corporate accountant. He scanned the crowded room wildly until his panicked eyes locked onto Richard. The accountant practically ran across the polished dance floor, pushing past several bewildered guests and waiters. He grabbed my father by the arm and pulled him aggressively into a secluded corner of the room away from the main crowd. Even from a distance across the ballroom, I could see the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the accountant body language. He leaned in and whispered frantically into my father's ear, his hands shaking as he held up a glowing smartphone screen. He told Richard that he had just received a massive emergency notification directly from the bank regional manager. He said the Beatrice family trust and her entire estate had officially been settled and permanently closed. The accountant voice cracked loudly, carrying across the quiet room as he delivered the final devastating blow. He said every single corporate and personal account was completely empty, and the entire $32 million was gone. I did not stay at the hotel to watch the rest of the fallout. The moment my father dropped his glass of scotch in sheer horror at the accountant's words, I quietly slipped out a side door and hailed a cab. I needed to return to my own territory. My apartment was a small one-bedroom walk-up in a working-class neighborhood. It had peeling paint on the windowsills and a radiator that clanked loudly during the night. It was everything my mother despised, but it was mine. I had barely taken off my black funeral dress and changed into a worn pair of jeans when a violent pounding rattled my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, demanding pounding of people who believed they owned the world and everyone in it. I walked to the door and looked through the scratched peephole. Richard, Gavin, and Catherine stood in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. My father was practically vibrating with rage, his face still flushed a dangerous shade of crimson from the humiliation at the hotel. Before I could even turn the deadbolt completely, Gavin shoved his shoulder against the cheap wood and forced the door open. He barged into my small living area, uninvited, tracking mud across my faded rug. My parents followed close behind him, acting as though they were stepping into a biohazard zone. Catherine immediately pulled her expensive fur coat tighter around her shoulders, looking around my modest home with overt disgust. Richard did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He stood in the center of my living room and pointed a stiff, demanding finger directly at my face. He ordered me to hand over the $8 million check Beatrice had given me on Christmas. He spoke with the absolute authority of a dictator, expecting his subjects to blindly comply. He claimed the money was never actually meant for me to keep. He spun a ridiculous, desperate lie, stating that Beatrice had always intended for those funds to be pooled directly into the family logistics business to secure the corporate legacy. He said the accountant was running the numbers, and the firm needed a massive infusion of liquid cash immediately. He demanded I go to my bedroom, retrieve the physical check, and sign it over to his holding company right this second. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demand settle in the quiet room. I asked him why he needed my check when he had been so quick to rip his own into shreds just a few days ago. The question hit a raw nerve. Gavin stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was uncomfortably close. The arrogant, polished facade of the golden child brother was completely gone. In its place was a desperate, sweating man teetering on the edge of absolute ruin. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were trembling uncontrollably. Gavin completely dropped the illusion of being a wildly successful vice president. He practically shouted that he needed his cut of the money right now. He confessed that the luxury cars, the expensive watches, and the country club memberships were all a massive fraudulent house of cards. He admitted he was currently $400,000 in debt to highly dangerous underground creditors. He said these were not reasonable bank managers who would negotiate payment plans. These were men who broke legs and ruined lives when they did not get paid on time. He aggressively grabbed my arm, demanding I write him a personal check immediately to cover his debts before the bookies found him. I firmly yanked my arm out of his grasp and took a deliberate step back. I looked at my brother and my father and told them absolutely not. I said my finances were none of their concern, and I was not bailing them out of the disasters they had created for themselves. The word no had always been unacceptable in our family dynamic. The moment the refusal left my lips, my mother, Catherine, immediately deployed her favorite weapon. She began to cry. It was not a genuine display of sorrow for the mother-in-law she had just buried. It was a calculated theatrical performance designed entirely to manipulate. Catherine dramatically covered her face with her hands and sobbed loudly, accusing me of purposefully tearing our family apart. She wailed that I was acting out of deep-seated petty jealousy because Courtney had a perfect marriage and a beautiful summer home while I had nothing. She claimed I was hoarding family wealth just to punish them for being more successful than me. Catherine stepped closer, her fake tears magically drying up as her voice turned sharp and demanding. She insisted that I owed them this money because they were my family. She reasoned that since the primary estate was inexplicably empty, and they had accidentally ruined their own checks, I was legally obligated to issue them replacement funds from my share. They stood in my living room completely convinced that the universe owed them millions of dollars simply because of their last name. They genuinely believed they could bully me into opening my bank accounts to fund their empty, toxic lifestyles. I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder in my tiny apartment. They were so blinded by their own entitlement that they could not see the massive trap closing around them. I decided it was time to let the trap snap shut. I stood perfectly straight and looked my father directly in the eyes. I told them I could not issue them replacement checks, even if I wanted to. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely void of emotion. I explained that Beatrice had structured the trust with a highly specific behavioral requirement. I told them it was called the gratitude clause. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the clanking of the old radiator in the corner. I watched the confusion wash over Richard's face as I slowly and deliberately explained the legal reality of their actions on Christmas night. I told them that the checks Beatrice handed out were not just gifts. They were legally binding financial instruments attached to a strict condition of acceptance. I explained that by willfully destroying, defacing, and discarding those checks, they did not just insult an old woman. They had legally and permanently renounced their entire claim to the inheritance. Gavin's face went completely chalk white. Catherine gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth in genuine horror. I did not stop speaking. I drove the final nail into the coffin with absolute precision. I told them that because they had violently rejected their shares, the trust protocol dictated a mandatory reallocation of all assets. I explained that the money did not simply vanish into thin air. Because they forfeited their claims, every single penny of the $32 million estate automatically defaulted to the sole remaining beneficiary who accepted the gift without complaint. I let the words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. I watched their eyes widen as they slowly did the math in their heads. I told them the estate was empty because the bank had legally transferred the entire balance into my personal accounts. I was the sole heir. They had literally ripped up their own millions and handed them directly to the daughter they despised. My father's face turned a terrifying shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He looked like he was about to suffer a stroke of his own. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger an inch from my nose. The mask of the civilized corporate executive was completely gone. He snarled like a cornered wild animal. He yelled that he was my father and he would not let a pathetic, ungrateful bookkeeper steal his empire. He promised he would freeze every single one of my bank accounts by tomorrow morning. He threatened to drag me through endless litigation, crush me in the state Supreme Court, and see me locked in a jail cell for elder abuse before he ever let me touch a dime of that money. Richard did not wait for a response. He spun on his heel and stormed out of my apartment, slamming the flimsy front door so hard the framed pictures on my wall rattled. Catherine and Gavin scrambled right behind him, their faces a mix of pure terror and boiling rage. The sudden quiet of my living room was deafening, but I did not feel fear. I felt an icy, absolute resolve. I knew my father. He was a man who waged scorched earth campaigns against anyone who defied his authority. His threat to crush me in court was not a simple dramatic exit line. It was a promise. He had spent his entire life crushing competitors and bending the rules to fit his narrative. He genuinely believed his expensive corporate lawyers could rewrite the ironclad legal documents Beatrice had left behind. The retaliation began less than 48 hours later. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking my morning coffee when a loud, aggressive knock startled me. A process server handed me a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. Richard had made his move. He hired the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state and filed an emergency injunction to freeze the Beatrice Family Trust and every single one of my personal bank accounts. I read through the filing, my stomach turning at the blatant, vicious lies printed on the official court stationery. My father accused me of egregious elder abuse. He officially claimed that Beatrice was suffering from severe advanced dementia and that I had maliciously manipulated a senile woman in her final days to alter her estate. He painted me as a calculating predator who took advantage of my accounting background to steal the family fortune. The local judge, swayed by Richard's prominent standing in the community and the sheer volume of his legal maneuvering, had granted a temporary freeze on all asset transfers. I immediately called Mr. Harrison at the bank. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with frustration. He assured me that his legal team at the International Holdings Trust was already preparing a massive counterstrike, but warned me that fighting the local injunction would take a few days to process through the proper jurisdictional channels. For the moment, I was locked out of the $32 million. Richard was trying to starve me out, relying on the fact that I lived paycheck to paycheck to force a quick surrender. But Richard's legal assault was only the first prong of their coordinated attack. Courtney decided to handle the public relations campaign. By noon, my phone was vibrating off the kitchen table with an endless stream of notifications. Courtney had taken to every major social media platform to launch a highly calculated public smear campaign. She posted a long, meticulously edited video of herself sitting in her designer living room, wiping away perfectly timed fake tears. She told her thousands of followers a heartbreaking story about her greedy, estranged sister who had systematically isolated their beloved grandmother from the rest of the family during her final vulnerable months. Courtney claimed I had blocked their phone calls, intercepted their visits, and preyed upon a sick old woman just to steal her meager life savings. She conveniently left out the fact that she had openly mocked Beatrice at Christmas and ripped an $8 million check to shreds. She framed herself as the grieving, devoted granddaughter fighting for justice. The flying monkeys descended instantly. Distant relatives, old high school acquaintances, and total strangers began flooding my inbox with vicious, hateful messages. They called me a gold digger, a monster, and a criminal. Courtney was purposefully destroying my personal reputation, making sure my name was synonymous with elder abuse. She wanted me isolated, ashamed, and begging for their mercy. I refused to let them see me crack. I put my phone on silent, dressed in my sharpest professional suit, and drove to the nonprofit organization where I worked. I needed the routine of my auditing job to keep me grounded while the bank lawyers dismantled my father's injunction. But the moment I walked into the main office, the receptionist gave me a wide, panicked look and told me the executive director was waiting for me in the boardroom. I walked into the glass-enclosed room to find my boss sitting at the head of the table, flanked by two board members. They looked incredibly grim. My boss slid a thick manila envelope across the table toward me. He said they had received an anonymous tip early that morning via a courier. The envelope contained a stack of highly manipulated financial documents showing severe discrepancies in the charity funding accounts I managed. The anonymous tipster accused me of embezzling thousands of dollars from the organization over the past 6 months to fund a lavish secret lifestyle. I looked down at the documents and immediately recognized the clumsy formatting and the specific spreadsheet software used to fabricate the numbers. It was Gavin. My brother had used his basic knowledge of corporate accounting to create a fake paper trail designed to destroy my career. I calmly looked at my boss and told him the documents were completely falsified and part of a vicious personal retaliation from my family. I pointed out the glaring errors in the fabricated ledgers and offered to open my entire hard drive for an immediate, transparent audit. My boss sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He said he believed me and knew my character, but the board of directors had strict protocols regarding any accusations of financial misconduct. He told me his hands were tied. He officially placed me on an immediate mandatory leave of absence without pay until an independent external investigation could clear my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had successfully cut off my only source of income, frozen the trust assets, and completely destroyed my public reputation, all before lunchtime. They were executing a flawless, coordinated siege designed to leave me destitute and terrified. Richard, Catherine, Gavin, and Courtney fully expected me to come crawling back to them by the end of the week, ready to sign away the $32 million just to get my life back. They thought they had backed me into a corner where I had absolutely no weapons left to fight with. They were completely wrong. I drove back to my apartment feeling a new, dangerous kind of fury burning in my chest. I locked my front door and threw my keys on the counter. The air in the small apartment felt heavy, but I was no longer playing defense. I walked straight into my bedroom and opened the small hidden compartment in the back of my closet. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy silver flash drive Mr. Harrison had given me in the subterranean bank vault. The drive Beatrice had left behind. The drive containing the final pieces of her master plan. I sat down at my small desk and booted up my personal laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I plugged the silver metal drive into the USB port. A password prompt immediately popped up on my screen, demanding a highly secure encryption key. I did not even have to guess. I typed in the exact date my grandfather passed away, the day Beatrice started planning her ultimate revenge. The prompt turned green, and the drive unlocked with a soft digital chime. Hundreds of meticulously organized folders flooded my screen. I clicked on the master directory labeled Richard Corporate Ledgers. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I did best. I audited the files. I completely detached my emotions and let the numbers tell me the true story. I tracked the offshore wire transfers, the heavily doctored quarterly reports, and the massive loans hidden behind layers of dummy corporations. What I found was absolutely staggering. It was not just proof that Richard's firm was failing. It was concrete, undeniable evidence of massive systematic corporate fraud. My father had not built a successful logistics empire at all. He had built a massive illegal Ponzi scheme surviving solely by siphoning funds from illegal shadow investors and heavily forging his tax documents to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. But the most shocking revelation was buried in a hidden subfolder labeled Primary Debt Obligations. I opened the file and stared at the digital promissory notes, reading the fine print over and over again, until the truth finally clicked into place. My father's current company was functionally bankrupt, surviving exclusively on massive high-interest loans provided by an anonymous offshore holding company. I cross-referenced the holding company routing numbers with the primary documents in the Beatrice family trust. The numbers matched perfectly. Beatrice had not just hidden her $32 million fortune, she had actively used it to quietly purchase every single piece of my father's corporate debt over the last decade. She was the anonymous offshore holding company. The entire fraudulent logistics firm Gavin inflated salary and Courtney massive trust fund were completely leveraged against the debt owned by Beatrice. And because the bank had legally transferred the Beatrice family trust entirely into my name, I was now the sole owner of that anonymous holding company. I did not just have $32 million in frozen assets. I was legally my father's biggest, most dangerous creditor. I owned his entire miserable empire. The vicious smear campaign Courtney was currently running on social media painted me as a calculating, manipulative monster who isolated a senile woman, but these encrypted files told the absolute, undeniable truth. My sister had mobilized her entire online following to harass my employer, resulting in my immediate suspension, but she was completely oblivious to the digital bomb I was about to drop on her privileged life. Beatrice was sharper than any of them. I scrolled through the endless digital rows of banking data. The silver flash drive had felt cold and heavy in my hand before I plugged it in, but now my laptop was running hot as it processed the massive cache of hidden files. My professional auditing background kicked into high gear. I opened multiple spreadsheet windows, dragging and dropping cross-referenced data points to build a comprehensive timeline of my father's financial crimes. I needed to see the exact moment the rot began. The earliest folder was stamped with a date from exactly 15 years ago. It was the week my grandfather Arthur had his fatal heart attack. Arthur was a stoic, hard-working man who built a regional shipping fleet from a single rusted delivery truck. When he passed away, his business and the substantial life insurance policies were explicitly intended to keep Beatrice comfortable and completely secure for the rest of her natural life. Richard had stepped in immediately, acting the part of the devoted, grieving son, taking the burden of the complex estate execution off his mother's shoulders. He lied to her with a straight face. I opened the banking logs from that specific month. Richard had established a massive network of untraceable offshore accounts. Within 30 days of the funeral, he began authorizing massive, unauthorized wire transfers. He quietly liquidated the life insurance policies and drained the operational capital of the shipping fleet under the guise of paying off imaginary corporate debts. He told Beatrice the company was drowning in liabilities and that he had to sell everything just to keep her out of bankruptcy. He forced her out of her beautiful historic home and shoved her into a cheap rundown condo in a bad neighborhood. He effectively left her completely destitute while secretly hoarding over $6 million of her rightful inheritance to start his own firm. The cold, clinical precision of his theft made my blood boil. I pulled up Beatrice's grocery receipts from a decade ago. She had meticulously logged her spending, carefully budgeting $30 a week for food so she could afford her necessary heart medication. She rode the city bus for 2 hours in the freezing snow because Richard claimed he could not afford to buy her a reliable used car. Meanwhile, my father was using her stolen millions to purchase a sprawling 8-bedroom marble mansion in Fairfield. He was buying Catherine imported sports cars and financing lavish European vacations. He was wearing custom Italian suits, bought with the money meant to keep his own mother warm. The level of sociopathic greed required to watch your mother suffer in poverty while you drank expensive champagne on a yacht was staggering. I opened the ledger detailing Richard's personal family expenditures and searched for my own name. I needed to see exactly what he had allocated for me during those years. The search returned absolutely zero results, but the columns designated for Gavin and Courtney were overflowing with sickening amounts of cash. Gavin received a $50,000 sports car for his 16th birthday and a fully funded $250,000 education at an elite private university. Courtney was gifted a luxury downtown penthouse the day she graduated and had her extravagant destination wedding paid entirely in cash. My father funneled every stolen dollar into them to project a flawless facade of dynastic generational wealth. My memory flashed back to my 18th birthday. I had sat in Richard's dark mahogany office holding an acceptance letter to my dream college. I had begged him to simply co-sign a basic student loan so I could attend. He looked me dead in the eye and coldly told me that the logistics business was going through a severe rough patch, and he could not risk the liability. He told me I was entitled and needed to learn the hard value of a dollar. I spent the next 4 agonizing years working 3 miserable jobs. I scrubbed greasy diner tables until 2 in the morning and unloaded heavy cardboard boxes in a freezing retail stockroom on the weekends, just to afford my basic textbooks and cheap ramen noodles. I skipped meals and walked miles in the rain because I could not afford bus fare. When the physical exhaustion forced me to move back into the family mansion after graduation, Richard had demanded I pay him $1,000 a month in rent. He claimed it was a necessary lesson in financial responsibility. He treated me like a parasitic burden, making me scrape and bleed for every single breath, while he was actively hiding millions from his own mother. He intentionally starved me of resources because I was the quiet, observant child who saw through his arrogance. He punished me for existing outside of his perfect, fraudulent illusion. I wiped a single furious tear from my cheek and aggressively clicked into the present-day corporate filings. The smear campaign my family was currently running against me was a desperate distraction. They were trying to ruin my reputation to cover up the fact that Richard's entire empire was collapsing. I audited the current tax returns and quarterly profit reports. My father's logistics firm was functionally dead. The business had not turned a legitimate legal profit in over 7 years. He had lost almost all of his major regional shipping contracts to younger, more efficient competitors. But his massive, fragile ego refused to downsize his lifestyle. To maintain the illusion of extreme wealth and to quietly cover Gavin, terrifying $400,000 underground gambling debts, Richard had resorted to taking out massive, highly illegal, high-interest corporate loans. He was desperate for liquid cash, and he found a private, anonymous offshore lending company willing to give him millions without asking any questions or requiring standard collateral. I opened the encrypted loan origination documents and traced the complex routing numbers back through the offshore web. Beatrice had not just sat quietly in her rundown condo knitting sweaters. She had been waiting in the shadows for 15 years. She had taken the tiny fraction of money she managed to hide from Richard, initial theft, and quietly invested it in highly lucrative anonymous tech startups. Over a decade, she aggressively multiplied her money, building a massive hidden fortune. When Richard's greed finally outpaced his stolen funds, Beatrice was waiting to catch him. She created the anonymous shell company. She personally authorized the predatory loans that kept Richard's failing business afloat. She deliberately fed his desperate ego, knowing he would blindly sign away his company, his mansion, and his soul, just to maintain his fake wealthy status. The digital files staring back at me proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard's current company was a hollow, rotting shell. It was surviving solely on these illegal shell company loans. And the primary debt holder of every single one of those massive, crushing loans was the Beatrice Family Trust. I leaned back in my desk chair, letting the absolute terrifying power of the situation sink in. The emergency injunction Richard had just filed to freeze my bank accounts was completely useless. He thought he was temporarily blocking me from inheriting a pile of cash. He had no idea that the $32 million was just the tip of the iceberg. The true value was the debt I now held in my hands. Because the trust had legally transferred to me, I was now the sole owner of the anonymous shell company. I completely controlled the debt. If I called in those loans today, Richard's firm would immediately default and crash into total bankruptcy. I held the exact mechanism to detonate his entire existence. I barely slept for a single second that night. The harsh blue glow of my laptop screen illuminated my small, modest bedroom until the sun began to rise over the city. I spent hours memorizing every single routing number, every heavily doctored tax return, and every predatory loan agreement Richard had blindly signed over the last decade. The sheer scale of his arrogance was breathtaking. He had built a fragile kingdom of cards and handed the match directly to the mother he thought he had discarded. I now held the trigger to detonate his entire fraudulent existence. When dawn finally broke, I showered quickly and dressed in my sharpest gray professional suit. I packed my laptop and the heavy silver flash drive into my leather briefcase. Mr. Harrison had texted me at 6 in the morning requesting an urgent meeting at the bank to discuss the temporary asset freeze my father had filed. I knew exactly what I was going to bring to that meeting. I walked out of my apartment complex and drove downtown with a strange, absolute calm, settling deep into my bones. The lifelong fear of my family was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating precision of a financial auditor who had just uncovered the ultimate smoking gun. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank lobby right as the antique grandfather clock struck 9. The morning rush of local business owners and tellers was in full swing, but my path to Mr. Harrison's secure back office was abruptly cut off. A wall of expensive tailored suits stepped directly in front of me, entirely blocking the main corridor. Richard and Catherine stood there flanked by a tall, slick man carrying an oversized leather briefcase. They had been waiting for me to arrive. My father's face was set in a mask of aggressive, unyielding authority. He stepped forward and grabbed my elbow, forcibly steering me away from the main teller stations toward a small, semi-private glass alcove typically used for loan applications. Catherine followed closely behind us, constantly checking over her shoulder to ensure no one in the lobby was watching their ambush too closely. I violently jerked my arm out of his grip the exact moment we were out of the main foot traffic. I stared him down and told him to keep his hands off me. Richard adjusted his silk tie and sneered. He did not offer an apology. Instead, he introduced the tall man standing next to him as his lead corporate litigator. The lawyer did not even bother to offer a professional greeting or extend a hand. He simply unclasped his expensive leather briefcase and slapped a thick, dense stack of legal documents onto the small glass table between us. He pulled out a specific piece of paper bearing the official embossed letterhead of a prominent local neurologist. The lawyer tapped his expensive gold pen against the page and smiled like a starving shark. He explained in a slick, condescending tone that he held a certified medical evaluation dated exactly 3 weeks before Christmas. The document explicitly stated that Beatrice was suffering from severe advanced stage dementia and was completely incapable of making any rational financial decisions. I stared at the paper, instantly recognizing the bold signature of the doctor at the bottom of the page. He was a regular prominent member of Richard Elite Country Club who frequently attended my parents' lavish catered dinner parties. My father had literally bought a fraudulent medical diagnosis from a golfing buddy to steal back the money. Richard leaned heavily over the glass table, deliberately invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. He lowered his voice into a dangerous, threatening register. He told me the game was officially over. He said his elite legal team had already submitted the medical evaluation to the state Supreme Court to permanently back up the emergency injunction. He painted a very clear, terrifying picture of what would happen to me next. He promised that the authorities would immediately launch a massive criminal investigation into my actions. He said they would rip apart my life, paint me as a manipulative, calculating predator who preyed upon a senile, helpless woman, and throw me in a state penitentiary for elder exploitation. He smiled cruelly, showing all his teeth, and said the local media would have an absolute field day with the scandalous story. My father wanted me paralyzed with absolute terror. He wanted me to firmly believe that he controlled the law, the public narrative, and my entire future. Then the slick lawyer slid a second piece of thick paper across the glass table. It was a pre-drafted legal settlement agreement sitting right next to a certified bank check made out to my specific name. I looked down at the printed amount. $100,000. Richard crossed his arms over his chest and told me he was being incredibly generous, given the dire circumstances I was currently facing. He said I was a struggling, pathetic bookkeeper who could barely afford to pay her monthly rent. He ordered me to sign the settlement agreement right now, permanently relinquishing any and all claims to the $32 million estate. In exchange for my signature, he promised he would hand over the check and gracefully drop the criminal elder abuse charges before the police arrived. He told me to take the money, pay off my pathetic mounting credit card debt, and walk away quietly before he ruined my life permanently. He genuinely expected me to fall to my knees in absolute gratitude and sign the paper without a single second of hesitation. I looked at the blatantly forged medical document. I looked at the insultingly low settlement check. Then I looked my father dead in the eye and let out a short, harsh laugh. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet glass alcove, catching them completely off guard. I told him his forged medical report was a pathetic, transparent joke, and I was not signing a single thing. The immediate blunt dismissal completely shattered their arrogant facade. Catherine lunged forward, her perfectly manicured hands shaking with uncontrollable rage. She grabbed my upper arm, digging her long, sharp acrylic nails deep into my skin through the thick fabric of my suit jacket. Her face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pulled me aggressively close, hissing violently directly into my face. She told me I was completely delusional and out of my mind. She spit the words like acid, claiming I had always been the defective, broken child of the family. She said I was a bitter, jealous, absolute failure who could not stand the fact that Courtney had a perfect, flawless life and Gavin was destined for corporate greatness. She tightened her vicious grip on my arm, shaking me slightly. She demanded I stop this embarrassing, pathetic tantrum immediately. She said I was a nobody who deserved absolutely nothing, and I should be on my knees begging and thanking them for offering me $100,000, when they could just as easily crush me into the dirt like an insect. She snarled that I would take the money and disappear forever, because I was too weak and pathetic to fight a real war against actual power. She demanded I pick up the pen and sign the document before she personally made sure I ended up rotting in a prison cell. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I was seconds away from telling her exactly who owned the massive predatory debt on her beautiful marble mansion when a heavy hand slammed firmly onto the glass table. The sharp, resounding crack echoed through the alcove, instantly breaking Catherine's physical hold on my arm. We all turned rapidly to see Mr. Harrison standing there, his face rigid with absolute professional fury. He was not alone. Two heavily armed bank security guards stood directly behind him, their hands resting casually but purposefully on their utility belts. Mr. Harrison's voice was like cracking ice in a quiet room. He ordered my mother to step away from his client immediately, or he would have his guards arrest her for physical assault right there in his lobby. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to aggressively assert his dominance over the bank manager. He stepped forward and loudly declared that this was a private family legal matter and none of the bank business. He aggressively pointed his finger at Mr. Harrison and stated that his lawyers had already officially served the bank with a state-mandated emergency injunction, freezing all of my assets. He demanded the bank manager back off immediately and let his high-powered legal team finish their business. Mr. Harrison did not even flinch at my father's arrogant, loud display. He calmly adjusted his tailored suit jacket and stepped smoothly between me and my furious, toxic family. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with dark red wax bearing a massive federal crest. He held the document up high so Richard and his high-priced litigator could clearly see the imposing insignia. Mr. Harrison looked at my father with a mixture of profound pity and absolute triumph. He informed Richard that his local state injunction was completely worthless, empty paper. He stated clearly that the Beatrice Family Trust was never registered or housed in the United States. He explained that the entire $32 million estate was established and heavily secured in a specialized, highly protected international jurisdiction. Mr. Harrison handed the sealed federal document directly to me. He looked back at Richard and delivered the final crushing blow. He said the International Trust was entirely immune to local court orders and petty state injunctions. The asset freeze had failed completely, and the money remained entirely in my control. The slick corporate lawyer stared at the red wax seal on the federal document like it was a venomous snake. His arrogant sneer vanished instantly, replaced by the panicked calculation of a man who suddenly realized he had marched into a minefield completely blind. He did not need to read the fine print to know Mr. Harrison was telling the absolute truth. International holding trusts established in offshore jurisdictions required years of complex federal litigation to even attempt to audit, let alone freeze with a simple municipal court order. The emergency injunction he had proudly slapped onto the glass table just moments ago was legally useless. It carried the exact same legal weight as a discarded grocery receipt. He hastily grabbed his forged medical document, shoved it back into his oversized leather briefcase, and snapped the brass clasps shut. He leaned in and whispered frantically into my father's ear. I watched the blood drain entirely from Richard's face. The commanding physical presence he had projected only a minute prior collapsed into a stiff, rigid posture of pure shock. He looked from his lawyer to Mr. Harrison and finally to me. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. Catherine was equally speechless, her hands still hovering awkwardly in the air where Mr. Harrison had forced her to release her painful grip on my arm. Mr. Harrison gestured to the two armed security guards standing at attention behind him. He calmly instructed them to escort the three trespassers out of the bank lobby and permanently revoke their building access. Richard did not fight back. He did not shout or threaten to ruin my life again. He simply turned around and walked toward the revolving glass doors, moving like a man walking to his own execution. Catherine stumbled after him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. I stood in the quiet glass alcove watching them disappear into the crowded morning street. The overwhelming sense of dread that had plagued me since childhood evaporated completely. Mr. Harrison turned to me and offered a warm, respectful smile. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me out of the public alcove toward the heavy oak doors of his private executive office suite. The air conditioning hummed quietly as we stepped into the massive room overlooking the busy downtown financial district. He directed me to sit in a plush leather chair positioned directly across from his large mahogany desk. He walked around the desk, logged into his secure desktop computer, and pressed a small silver button on his phone console to order 2 black coffees. He sat back, folded his hands together, and looked at me with deep professional admiration. He told me he had dealt with hundreds of aggressive, greedy family members throughout his long career in wealth management, but the level of pure hostility my parents just displayed was entirely unprecedented. He officially confirmed that the temporary hold on my accounts had been completely wiped from their internal system. The $32 million was entirely liquid, fully unfrozen, and absolutely under my total unhindered control. But Mr. Harrison did not stop there. He leaned forward and tapped his keyboard, bringing up a highly encrypted financial dashboard on his monitor. He told me that liquid cash was only the surface level of the Beatrice family trust. He explained that my grandmother had left very specific detailed instructions regarding the exact moment the funds were completely secured in my name. He turned the large monitor around so it faced me directly. He told me it was time to look at the actual structural portfolio of the trust. He knew about my extensive professional background as a forensic auditor, and he wanted me to see exactly how Beatrice had spent the last 15 years organizing her master plan. I pulled my chair closer to the desk and stared at the glowing screen. The dashboard displayed a vast, incredibly complex labyrinth of international holding companies, offshore proxy firms, and layered corporate entities. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering designed to completely obscure the true identity of the primary account holder. I opened the master ledger and began cross-referencing the data strings with the staggering information I had decrypted on the silver flash drive the previous night. I traced the routing numbers through 3 different international shell corporations located in jurisdictions known for their impenetrable banking secrecy laws. Beatrice had not simply parked her massive fortune in standard mutual funds or low-yield government bonds. She had actively weaponized her wealth. I clicked into the primary asset allocation folder, and my breath hitched in my throat. I followed the digital paper trail, watching the money move from the offshore proxy firms directly into the domestic commercial lending sector. Over the course of the last decade, Beatrice had systematically purchased massive blocks of high-risk corporate debt. She specifically targeted regional logistics companies operating in the Northeast sector. I opened the subfolder detailing the largest debt acquisitions and stared at the names of the corporate entities. the puzzle pieces locked together with terrifying, flawless precision. Beatrice had used her anonymous proxy firms to buy out every single major loan mortgage and line of credit attached to Richard Logistics' empire. I explained exactly what I was seeing to Mr. Harrison, my voice barely above an awed whisper. When Richard Firm began hemorrhaging money due to his severe mismanagement and blatant fraud, he had desperately sought capital to keep his fake empire afloat. Traditional domestic banks had refused to lend him money because his profit margins were completely fabricated. So he turned to private anonymous corporate lenders willing to offer millions in exchange for exorbitant interest rates and draconian collateral terms. He had no idea that the anonymous lender approving those massive lifelines was his own mother. She had funded his entire fraudulent existence while simultaneously wrapping a titanium chain directly around his neck. The sheer scale of her genius was breathtaking. She knew Richard Ego would never allow him to downsize his lavish lifestyle or admit defeat. She knew he would blindly sign away every single asset he possessed just to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. I opened the master collateral agreements attached to the massive corporate loans. To secure the desperate funding, Richard had legally leveraged everything. The sprawling 8-bedroom marble mansion in Fairfield was listed as primary collateral. The luxury sports cars, the expensive offshore vacation properties, and the massive corporate offices were all fully leveraged. But the most staggering revelation was buried in the payroll liability clauses. Richard had legally tied the corporate operational accounts to the loans, meaning Gavin inflated six-figure executive salary and Courtney massive monthly trust fund disbursements were directly funded by the debt Beatrice controlled. I sat back in the leather chair, my mind racing through the absolute magnitude of the power I now held. I was not just a newly minted multimillionaire. I was legally my father's biggest, most dangerous creditor. Every single dollar flowing through his corrupt logistics firm belonged exclusively to me. Every expensive designer outfit Courtney bought to look successful on social media was paid for by my money. Every expensive dinner Gavin bought to impress his elite friends was funded by my offshore accounts. They had spent their entire lives treating me like dirt, throwing me their leftover scraps, and demanding I thank them for the privilege. They had just tried to freeze my bank accounts and throw me in a state penitentiary for elder abuse. And all the while they were completely entirely owned by the very trust they were desperately trying to steal. Mr. Harrison watched my face process the reality of the situation. He smiled a tight, grim smile and asked me how I wished to proceed. He reminded me that as the sole controller of the Beatrice Family Trust, I had the absolute legal authority to execute the terms of the debt obligations. According to the documents, Richard Firm was already in severe technical default due to multiple missed interest payments over the last 2 financial quarters. Beatrice had simply chosen not to enforce the penalties, waiting for me to take the reins. I did not hesitate for a single second. I asked Mr. Harrison to access the secure document vault and physically print out the master corporate promissory notes. He nodded, clicking his mouse and sending the heavily encrypted files to the secure laser printer humming in the corner of his executive office. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of dense, legally binding contracts. I stood up and walked over to the printer, picking up the thick stack of warm paper. I held the physical debt notes in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of the textured parchment. The signatures at the bottom of each page belonged to Richard, Catherine, and Gavin. They had all blindly signed their lives away, completely oblivious to the trap Beatrice had painstakingly built around them. I looked at the specific liquidation clauses printed clearly in bold black ink. I held the absolute unmitigated power to seize the Fairfield mansion, freeze the corporate payroll accounts, and force the logistics firm into immediate catastrophic liquidation with a single signature. I could render my entire family completely destitute by the end of the business day. They would lose their luxury cars, their elite country club memberships, and their pristine public reputations. They would be forced to face the exact same poverty and humiliation they had subjected me and Beatrice to for 15 long years. So, I walked back to the mahogany desk and placed the heavy stack of promissory notes carefully into my leather briefcase. I zipped it shut and locked the brass clasps. I did not want to simply pull the trigger from the safety of a bank office. I wanted to look my father in the eye when his entire fake empire crumbled into dust. I wanted Courtney and Gavin to be sitting in the room when they realized the defective broken sister they had mocked their entire lives now owned their very existence. I reached into my suit jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I opened my messages and pulled up my father contact. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, typing out the message with cold, calculating precision. I did not hedge, and I did not offer any clues about the absolute devastation heading their way. I simply set the trap and waited for them to walk willingly right into the jaws of it. I pressed send and watched the small message bubble turn green. You win. Let's schedule a mediation to sign over the assets. The text message delivered with a soft digital chime that seemed entirely too innocent for the absolute destruction it carried. I watched the read receipt appear under my father's name almost instantly. He was probably staring at his phone in his lavish home office, gripping his expensive Scotch glass and basking in his fabricated victory. Mr. Harrison stood quietly by his mahogany desk, observing my demeanor with the sharp, analytical gaze of a seasoned financial veteran. I looked up from my screen and met his eyes completely devoid of the panic that had ruled my life just 24 hours ago. I told him my father had taken the bait. Mr. Harrison offered a slow, approving nod. He understood exactly what kind of game we were playing now. We were not just going to beat Richard in a courtroom, we were going to execute a flawless corporate siege, and we were going to make him eagerly walk into the slaughterhouse of his own free will. We spent the next 3 hours turning his executive office into a war room. I needed to ensure this mediation looked perfectly legitimate to my high-priced corporate litigation team. If Richard suspected for even a fraction of a second that I held the promissory notes to his entire fraudulent logistics empire, he would immediately attempt to liquidate everything and flee to a non-extradition country. He was a cornered animal, wearing a custom Italian suit, and he needed to feel absolute dominance to remain compliant. I instructed Mr. Harrison to contact the most prestigious top-tier law firm in the downtown financial district. We needed a neutral ground with an intimidating mahogany boardroom that smelled of old money and raw power. The kind of room that would stroke my father's massive, fragile ego and make him feel like an undisputed king, accepting the unconditional surrender of a defeated peasant. My newly retained legal counsel drafted the formal invitation for the mediation and asset distribution meeting, with meticulous, calculated precision. We explicitly worded the document to read like a complete capitulation. The legal brief requested a formal sit-down to discuss the immediate transfer of the Beatrice Family Trust and the total relinquishment of my rights to any contested estate funds. We even included a pathetic-sounding clause requesting a minor personal living stipend to further sell the illusion of my total, desperate defeat. I felt a wave of nausea typing out those specific words, but the cold logic of my auditing brain knew it was the perfect bait. My father fed on the weakness of others. Seeing my written submission would be an irresistible feast for his narcissism. The response from his legal team arrived the very next morning. It was swift, aggressive, and dripping with unchecked arrogance. They accepted the mediation invitation, but dictated a strict timeline, demanding we meet that coming Friday at exactly 10 in the morning. They also included a rigid list of non-negotiable demands requiring me to bring all original trust documents, banking tokens, and a certified checkbook to immediately transfer the frozen liquid assets. Richard was completely blind to his own impending doom. He was so entirely blinded by his greed and his lifelong belief in my absolute inferiority that he never bothered to verify the offshore jurisdictional status of the trust. He simply assumed his local judge and his bullying tactics had successfully crushed my spirit, just as they had done every single day of my childhood. The psychological warfare from my family escalated almost immediately after the mediation was set. They wanted to make sure I spent the days leading up to the meeting drowning in anxiety and shame. Catherine began calling my phone from unknown numbers, leaving long, vicious voicemails detailing exactly how she planned to spend the returned trust money. She vividly described the kitchen renovations and the new luxury vehicles she was going to purchase, laughing cruelly into the receiver and reminding me that I would be lucky to afford groceries by the end of the month. I saved every single voicemail, placing them into a digital folder. They were not hurting me anymore. They were simply providing me with the fuel I needed to remain perfectly, absolutely cold. But Gavin delivered the most venomous strike. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a direct text message from my brother. I opened the notification and stared at the screen. "Glad you finally realized you can't beat Dad. Bring the checkbook and maybe I'll let you wash my new car." The sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from those two sentences was staggering. Gavin was a man who had never earned a single dollar in his entire miserable life. He sat in a lavish corner office playing video games while his fraudulent corporate salary was entirely funded by the offshore debt Beatrice had secretly purchased. He was a literal parasite, mocking the host that was currently keeping him alive. I did not reply to his cruel message. I took a screenshot and saved it directly to my desktop. I wanted to remember the exact wording of his arrogance when I officially shut off his massive payroll account. Courtney was equally unbearable. She escalated her public smear campaign on social media, posting triumphant, cryptic updates about justice prevailing and toxic family members finally being removed from their lives. She posted a photo of herself holding a glass of expensive champagne on the Fairfield Mansion terrace, wearing a designer dress paid for by the shell company I now completely controlled. She had thousands of strangers validating her fake victimhood, completely unaware that the very ground she was standing on was legally forfeit. I watched her digital performance with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying organism. Their gloating was no longer a weapon against me. It was simply the desperate flailing of a family completely ignorant of the avalanche suspended directly above their heads. I spent the remaining 48 hours before the mediation locked in my apartment, executing the most intense, forensic deep dive of my entire professional career. I did not eat, and I barely slept. I drank black coffee and let the numbers guide my hands. I compiled every single fraudulent wire transfer, every heavily doctored quarterly profit report, and every piece of definitive proof showing Richard's massive illegal Ponzi scheme. I organized the data into an ironclad, undeniable forensic accounting report. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction. The report detailed exactly how Richard had systematically drained my grandfather's legitimate business to fund his lavish lifestyle, and how he had kept his current logistics firm alive solely through illegal shadow investments and the offshore proxy debt held by Beatrice. But compiling the internal report was only the first half of my ultimate trap. I needed external, undeniable authority to drop the hammer. Using the massive resources and high-level connections provided by Mr. Harrison International Trust Department, I bypassed the corrupt local authorities entirely. I reached out directly to the federal financial regulators. I requested an emergency secure teleconference with a senior agent at the Regional White-Collar Crime Division. I presented a carefully curated, heavily redacted sample of my father's tax fraud and offshore wire transfers. I did not need to show them the entire picture, just enough to prove that a major regional logistics firm was operating a massive illegal financial syndicate. The federal agent took one look at the routing numbers and the doctored ledgers and immediately escalated my file to the top of his priority list. I informed the federal regulators about the upcoming mediation meeting. I provided them with the exact address, the specific floor number, and the scheduled time. I explained that Richard would be sitting in that room proudly detailing his financial assets and fully expecting to receive a massive influx of stolen capital. The federal agent assured me that his elite task force would be waiting in the wings, ready to execute the warrants the absolute second I gave the signal. My father thought he was bringing a local corrupt lawyer to bully a helpless girl. He had no idea I was bringing the entire weight of the federal government to completely obliterate his existence. The morning of the mediation arrived with a crisp, freezing clarity. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and carefully buttoned my tailored charcoal gray suit. I tied my hair back into a severe tight bun and applied minimal makeup. I did not want to look pretty or accommodating. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a highly trained corporate auditor arriving to execute a hostile takeover. I looked at my reflection and did not see the terrified, broken daughter who used to shrink under Richard's booming voice. I saw the rightful heir to Beatrice's legacy. I saw a woman who held the absolute power to dismantle a decades-long campaign of cruelty and financial abuse. I walked over to my desk and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I unzipped the main compartment and checked the contents one final time. I was not bringing a checkbook. I was not bringing an apology letter or a signed surrender document. Inside the dark leather interior sat the pristine, freshly printed master promissory notes, proving I owned every single piece of Richard corporate debt. Right next to them sat the massive comprehensive forensic accounting report, detailing his extensive federal tax fraud. And resting securely in my jacket pocket was the direct contact number for the senior federal agent, currently sitting in an unmarked black vehicle right outside the prestigious law firm. The trap was fully set, the bait had been swallowed, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. I grabbed my keys, walked out of my apartment, and locked the door behind me. It was time to go liquidate my family. The elevator shot up to the 54th floor of the towering glass skyscraper with a silent stomach dropping speed. I stepped out into the pristine, sterile reception area of the city's most ruthless corporate law firm. A receptionist in a sharp-tailored designer outfit guided me down a long, intimidating corridor built of polished marble and heavy frosted glass. We entered a massive corner boardroom featuring spectacular floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the gray, sprawling financial district below. The room was entirely dominated by a massive, solid mahogany conference table surrounded by intimidating black leather ergonomic chairs. I chose a seat near the middle of the long table, placing my heavy leather briefcase squarely on the polished wood surface. I did not touch the complimentary sparkling water or the pristine legal pads provided at every seat. I simply sat perfectly still, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the performance to begin. They made me wait exactly 25 minutes. It was a classic aggressive corporate power play specifically designed to make the opponent feel small, anxious, and insignificant. When the heavy glass doors finally swung open, my family did not just enter the room, they invaded it. Richard marched in first, projecting the aura of a conquering emperor returning from a glorious, victorious campaign. Catherine followed closely behind him, clutching an incredibly rare exotic crocodile skin handbag like a royal scepter. Gavin sauntered in, scrolling mindlessly on his latest expensive smartphone, while Courtney brought up the rear, checking her flawless reflection in the dark tinted glass of the boardroom door. They were radiating extreme, unearned wealth and suffocating arrogance. Richard wore a custom-tailored navy pinstripe suit that likely cost more than my entire annual auditing salary. Catherine was draped in authentic vintage Chanel, her thin wrists glittering with heavy stacked gold tennis bracelets. They moved with absolute arrogant entitlement, expecting everyone in their immediate orbit to bow down to their clearly superior status. Catherine stopped on the opposite side of the table and looked me up and down with an expression of pure, visceral disgust. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh and dropped her incredibly expensive handbag onto the mahogany surface with a heavy thud. She stared directly at my plain charcoal gray suit and shook her head in mock pity. She told me I looked entirely pathetic and incredibly washed out. She loudly asked Richard why I constantly insisted on wearing off the rack department store trash to a high-level professional legal negotiation. She claimed my cheap appearance was a profound embarrassment to the prestigious family name, and that I should have at least made a marginal effort to look presentable for my official absolute surrender. Gavin finally looked up from his glowing phone screen and let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. He leaned lazily against the high back of his leather chair and loudly asked if I had brought my checkbook like he specifically commanded in his text message. He smirked and pointedly reminded me that his newly imported luxury sports car was parked in the VIP executive garage downstairs, and the wheels were looking a little dusty from the drive. I did not react to the barrage of insults. I kept my face entirely blank and devoid of emotion, locking my eyes directly onto my father. Richard took the seat at the absolute head of the table, physically asserting his undeniable dominance over the entire room. He did not bother to sit down immediately. Instead, he leaned his heavy, imposing frame over the polished mahogany and stared at me with pure, predatory malice. He sharply snapped his fingers, and the slick corporate lawyer who had accompanied him at the bank scurried forward, immediately producing a thick, heavily bound legal document. Richard snatched the document from the lawyer and violently slid it all the way across the long table until it hit the edge of my leather briefcase. He did not offer any basic pleasantries or fake paternal warmth. He coldly told me we were done playing childish games. He stated that the document sitting directly in front of me was an absolute, unconditional surrender of every single asset tied to the Beatrice family trust. My father's booming voice echoed harshly off the cold glass walls, filling the room with aggressive, toxic authority. He demanded that I sign away 100% of the $32 million immediately without reading a single page. He outlined his terms with sickening, absolute arrogance. If I picked up the pen and legally transferred the entire offshore estate into his personal corporate holding accounts. Right now, he would permanently call off his vicious legal attack dogs. He promised he would instruct his lawyer to permanently destroy the forged medical evaluation claiming Beatrice had severe advanced dementia. He told me he would graciously drop the entirely fabricated criminal elder abuse charges that were currently hanging over my head like a guillotine. He smiled a vicious shark-like smile and said this was my one and only chance to walk out of the skyscraper without federal handcuffs on my wrists. He ordered me to sign the papers, take the pathetic $100,000 settlement check he had previously offered, and disappear from their lives forever. Courtney sat down gracefully next to Catherine, crossing her long tanned legs and dramatically flipping her perfectly styled, expensive blonde hair over her shoulder. She let out a sharp, condescending scoff and leaned forward, resting her elbows aggressively on the table. She looked at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated venom. She told me to stop dragging this pathetic charade out and just sign the damn contract. She sneered that I was completely delusional if I genuinely thought I could ever beat our brilliant father in a highly complex corporate war. She said I was entirely incompetent and lacked the basic fundamental intelligence to handle a multi-million-dollar financial empire. She smiled cruelly, showcasing her perfectly bleached teeth. She told me I could not handle Dad's massive business because I was far too weak and fundamentally pathetic. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a vicious, mocking whisper that carried across the quiet room. She said I could not even handle keeping a fiancé. The sudden, sharp mention of David hung heavily in the cold, sterile air of the boardroom. Exactly 3 years ago, I was happily engaged to a kind, hard-working man named David. Our relationship had shattered suddenly and violently, exactly 2 months before our scheduled wedding day. David had walked into my small apartment, packed his bags with frantic, angry energy, and left without giving me a single coherent explanation. He simply looked at me with profound, absolute disgust and walked out the front door, forever leaving me completely heartbroken and entirely confused. Courtney carefully watched my face, eagerly looking for a pained, emotional reaction. She laughed, a high-pitched tinkling sound that sent freezing ice water rushing directly through my veins. She proudly confessed right there in front of our parents that she had personally orchestrated my entire broken engagement. She boasted about how incredibly easy it was to utterly destroy my fleeting happiness. She happily explained how she had secretly stolen David's unlocked phone during a crowded family dinner and sent highly incriminating manufactured text messages to his jealous ex-girlfriend. Courtney did not stop there. She openly reveled in her extreme cruelty, explicitly bragging about the extensive campaign of psychological sabotage she had waged entirely behind my back. She told the quiet room how she had cornered David at a local downtown bar and whispered vicious, calculated lies about my severe financial instability and my supposed secret desire to actively cheat on him. She claimed she had purposely hired a mutual friend to casually approach David and independently confirm the fabricated rumors. She systematically and ruthlessly poisoned his mind, until he was utterly convinced I was a manipulative, deceitful monster. Courtney leaned back in her expensive leather chair and smiled a massive, triumphant smile. She explicitly stated she had destroyed my future marriage out of pure, unadulterated spite. She absolutely hated seeing me happy, and she simply wanted to prove that she possessed the total power to take away anything I loved. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was born to be a miserable loser, and I desperately needed to accept my rightful place at the absolute bottom of the family food chain. My parents did not reprimand Courtney for her sociopathic confession. Catherine actually offered a small, incredibly proud smile, softly patting Courtney's arm, as if praising a gifted child for winning a complex spelling bee. Richard ignored the devastating revelation entirely, sharply tapping his heavy gold watch and demanding I pick up the expensive silver pen resting next to the predatory settlement contract. They all sat there comfortably basking in their perceived absolute victory. They firmly, genuinely believed they had successfully crushed my spirit, cornered me with terrifying legal threats, and completely humiliated me with the brutal truth about my ruined engagement. They fully expected me to break down in hysterical, pathetic tears, grab the silver pen, and frantically sign away my entire future, just to escape their overwhelming toxic presence. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not cry a single tear. I did not react to the sickening, heartbreaking truth about David, or the aggressive legal threats looming dangerously over my head. I sat perfectly, completely still, letting the profound, heavy silence stretch agonizingly across the massive mahogany table. The complete lack of an emotional response deeply unsettled my father. His arrogant, confident sneer faltered slightly as he watched me slowly and deliberately reach toward my heavy leather briefcase. I snapped the twin brass clasps open. The sharp metallic sound echoed sharply in the quiet, tense boardroom. I bypassed the thick stack of master promissory notes and the dense federal forensic accounting report. Instead, I reached into a specific side pocket and pulled out a sleek, unmarked black folder. I placed the dark folder carefully on the table. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I opened the heavy cover and pulled out 4 individual sheets of high-quality, thick, glossy photo paper. I reached across the wide table and slid the 4 enlarged high-definition photographs directly toward Richard. They slid smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a complete stop directly over the predatory settlement contract. The glossy, vivid images clearly displayed the torn, violently shredded pieces of the 4 $8 million checks from Christmas night, meticulously retrieved from the garbage and painstakingly pieced back together. The heavy silence in the massive glass-walled boardroom was deafening. Richard stared down at the 4 glossy, high-definition photographs I had just slid across the polished mahogany table. His arrogant, confident sneer slowly dissolved, replacing itself with a look of profound, absolute confusion. He reached out with a slightly trembling hand and picked up the top photograph. The image clearly displayed the jagged, violent tear lines running directly through his printed name on the certified $8 million bank check. The clear adhesive tape I had used to painstakingly piece the shredded fragments back together caught the harsh overhead fluorescent light. He recognized exactly what he was looking at. He recognized his own destructive handiwork from Christmas night. Catherine leaned over his shoulder, her expensive perfume wafting across the table. Her face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. She demanded to know why I was presenting them with pictures of literal garbage. Courtney and Gavin exchanged confused, uneasy glances, completely failing to grasp the gravity of the situation unfolding directly in front of them. Gavin smirked and muttered that I was clearly losing my mind bringing trash to a multi-million-dollar legal negotiation. They still genuinely believed they held the absolute upper hand. They still firmly believed the predatory contract sitting on the table was my only escape route. The man seated quietly to my immediate right finally moved. Mr. Sterling, my lead corporate counsel and a senior partner at the prestigious international firm hosting our meeting, slowly stood up. He did not possess the slick, desperate energy of my father, local litigator. Mr. Sterling radiated the terrifying calm authority of a man who routinely dismantled billion-dollar conglomerates before his morning coffee. He smoothly buttoned his tailored suit jacket and looked down at my furious family with an expression of mild clinical pity. He reached into his own leather attaché case and produced a thick, heavy document bound in dark blue leather. It was the original, unredacted master copy of the Beatrice Family Trust. Mr. Sterling did not address my father aggressively. He spoke in a smooth, measured cadence that demanded absolute attention. He informed the room that before any further discussion regarding asset distribution or criminal charges could occur, he was legally obligated to read a specific primary stipulation buried deep within the offshore trust framework. He opened the heavy leather binder and turned to a page marked with a red tab. He announced that he would now read the exact parameters of the gratitude and acceptance provision orchestrated personally by my late grandmother. My father, local lawyer, shifted uncomfortably in his ergonomic chair, his eyes darting nervously toward the thick blue binder. He had never seen this specific document. He had relied entirely on state-level municipal filings, which were completely blind to the international clauses. Mr. Sterling began to read the dense, complex legal text. Beatrice knew her family intimately. She knew they were profoundly greedy, entitled, and viciously ungrateful. She knew they would view an $8 million equal distribution not as a monumental, life-changing gift, but as a severe personal insult because it was not the absolute total amount. She accurately predicted that their massive, fragile egos would cause them to reject the offering in a dramatic display of dominance. The gratitude and acceptance provision explicitly stated that any named beneficiary who willfully destroys, defaces, explicitly rejects, or actively refuses to legally deposit their initial financial disbursement within a strict 30-day window is legally classified as executing a total, unconditional renunciation of their entire claim to the estate. The words hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. Richard dropped the glossy photograph of his shredded check back onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Catherine gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. The smug, arrogant smiles vanished instantly from Courtney, and Gavin faces entirely replaced by a creeping, suffocating dread. Mr. Sterling closed the heavy blue binder with a sharp, definitive thud. He looked directly at my father and delivered the absolute crushing reality. He explained that by physically ripping the certified checks into pieces on Christmas night, an act that was meticulously retrieved, photographed, and legally documented, they did not simply insult me. They executed a legally binding permanent renunciation of their inheritance. Their own violent, unchecked arrogance had triggered the exact trap Beatrice had painstakingly designed. Gavin leaped out of his chair, his face flushing a deep, panicked crimson. He aggressively pointed a finger at Mr. Sterling and shouted that it was just a stupid joke. He stammered frantically, claiming they were just trying to make a point and that they never actually intended to legally forfeit their money. He demanded that I write him a new replacement check right this second. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and ordered me to stop playing this ridiculous game. Mr. Sterling did not even flinch at my brother's outburst. He calmly instructed Gavin to sit back down, or he would have building security forcibly remove him from the premises. He turned his attention back to Richard and delivered the final, absolute fatal blow. He stated that because Richard, Catherine, Gavin, and Courtney had legally renounced their shares, the highly specific default mechanism of the offshore trust had officially activated. According to international financial law, when beneficiaries willingly forfeit their designated disbursements, the entire remaining balance of the estate automatically defaults to the sole remaining beneficiary, who accepted the initial gift in good faith. Mr. Sterling looked my father dead in the eye and confirmed the absolute harsh reality. The entire $32 million fortune was legally, permanently, and irreversibly mine. There was no complex legal loophole to exploit. There was no local municipal judge who could overturn the international provision. The money was locked untethered and entirely in my possession. Their aggressive emergency injunction was a complete failure. Their predatory settlement contract, demanding I sign over the assets, was entirely useless because they possessed absolutely zero legal leverage. They had willingly burned their own millions to ashes just to mock me. Courtney let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She violently slammed her manicured hands onto the boardroom table, completely shattering her composed, flawless facade. She screamed that I had deliberately set them up. She shrieked that I was a manipulative, calculating monster who had tricked them into destroying their own inheritance. She looked at our parents and frantically demanded they do something to fix this massive disaster. She shouted that she desperately needed her $8 million to maintain her luxury lifestyle, and she refused to let a pathetic, broken loser like me steal her rightful future. She tried to bring up my ruined engagement again, viciously stating that a woman who could not even keep a man from walking out the door did not deserve to control a multi-million-dollar fortune. I simply looked at her and offered a slow, cold nod. I absolutely set them up. I handed them the rope and watched them eagerly, enthusiastically tie their own nooses. I let them hang themselves with their own monumental, unyielding hubris. I did not need to defend myself against her cruel insults about David anymore. Her vicious sabotage of my past relationship meant absolutely nothing in the face of her current total financial annihilation. She was throwing empty punches at a brick wall. Richard, local lawyer, attempted a weak, pathetic defense. He stammered loudly, claiming the provision was highly unethical and that no court in the state would ever uphold such a draconian hidden clause. Mr. Sterling cut him off with surgical precision. He coldly reminded the sweating lawyer that the Beatrice Family Trust was housed entirely in a highly protected sovereign international jurisdiction, immune to domestic ethical complaints and local state appeals. He advised the lawyer to pack up his useless, fraudulent medical documents and his predatory settlement agreements and leave the room before he was officially reported to the State Bar Association for attempting to extort a federal trust holder. The slick litigator snapped his briefcase shut and backed away from the table, completely abandoning his wealthy clients in their moment of total, absolute ruin. The realization finally crashed into Richard. He realized the $32 million was gone forever. He realized his intimidating physical presence, his loud booming voice, and his lifelong campaign of psychological terror had completely failed. He had lost. He had been completely outsmarted by the daughter he had spent 30 years treating like a defective, broken burden. The massive, fragile ego that defined his entire existence violently exploded. Richard stood up abruptly, his heavy chair crashing backward into the glass wall. His face turned a dangerous, violent shade of purple, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the solid mahogany table with a thunderous, resonant crack that echoed violently through the massive room. He leaned over the table, spitting with pure, unadulterated rage. He shouted that I was a deceitful, calculating thief. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face and bellowed that I could keep the dead old woman pathetic cash. He desperately tried to salvage his shattered pride by aggressively asserting his own independent wealth. He screamed that he did not need a single penny of Beatrice offshore money. He proudly declared that he had built a massive, untouchable corporate logistics empire entirely from the ground up through his own sheer brilliance. He claimed his company generated more gross revenue in a single financial quarter than I would ever see in my entire miserable, pathetic life. He roared that he was a titan of local industry and I was nothing more than a glorified bookkeeper playing with a lucky inheritance. He demanded I take my money and get the hell out of his sight before he personally destroyed my career in the financial sector. I sat perfectly still, letting his furious, desperate rant wash entirely over me. I did not shrink back from his aggressive posturing, and I did not break eye contact. I let him scream about his massive self-made wealth and his untouchable corporate empire. I let him firmly believe he still possessed a solid, impregnable fortress to retreat to. Then I smiled. It was a cold, absolute, terrifying smile that instantly silenced his booming, furious shouting. I slowly reached into the dark interior of my leather briefcase and pulled out a small, sleek silver presentation remote. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and looked directly at the man who had tormented me my entire life. Speaking of your massive untouchable empire, Dad, I raised the silver remote and pressed the primary button. The heavy motorized blackout blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows automatically descended, plunging the massive boardroom into sudden dramatic darkness. The high-definition digital projector mounted on the ceiling whirred to life, casting a blinding, brilliant light directly onto the large white presentation screen occupying the far wall. The screen illuminated the dark room with stark, undeniable clarity. It was not a presentation about trust law or offshore bank accounts. It was the heavily decrypted master file containing Beatrice's secret corporate ledgers. It was the comprehensive forensic accounting report detailing every single high-interest predatory loan mortgage and completely leveraged payroll account tied directly to his failing logistics firm. The harsh white light from the digital projector washed over the terrified faces of my family. They sat completely frozen in their ergonomic black leather chairs, staring up at the massive screen in absolute stunned silence. Rows of highly complex financial data read, highlighted deficit warnings, and offshore wire transfer logs scrolled continuously across the bright display. The low mechanical hum of the projector fan was the only sound in the freezing glass-walled boardroom. I walked slowly around the edge of the polished mahogany table, stepping directly into the path of the bright projector beam. I pointed to the top left corner of the screen, where Richard's primary corporate operational account was laid bare for everyone in the room to clearly see. I did not raise my voice or shout. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of a forensic executioner reading a final, inescapable verdict. I walked them through 15 years of relentless, systematic financial crimes. I detailed exactly how Richard had actively embezzled millions from my grandfather, legitimate shipping business routing the stolen capital, through dummy shell companies located in the Cayman Islands to completely evade federal tax laws. I highlighted the massive wire fraud he committed every single financial quarter, intentionally inflating his profit margins with fake invoices from phantom vendors to secure desperate capital injections from anonymous offshore lenders. I showed the room the exact dates, times, and routing numbers of his illegal transfers. The evidence was absolute ironclad and entirely irrefutable. My father's skin turned the sickly color of wet ash. He opened his mouth to bark a denial, but his voice completely failed him. I immediately advanced the slide on the presentation screen. I was not finished dismantling them. I turned my attention directly to my older brother. Gavin sat paralyzed, his expensive imported smartphone completely forgotten in his lap. I projected a new, highly detailed forensic spreadsheet displaying his personal executive expense accounts. I ruthlessly exposed his massive illegal siphoning of corporate funds. I showed the entire room exactly how he had masked the purchase of 3 luxury imported sports cars as essential fleet operational expenses for the logistics firm. I highlighted the lavish VIP club tabs, the expensive international vacations to Dubai, and the massive offshore gambling debts he had fraudulently written off as corporate client entertainment. I looked Gavin dead in the eye and told him his entire life of luxury was built on severe federal wire fraud and blatant corporate embezzlement. I informed him that his signature was on every single fraudulent expense report, making him fully legally liable for the stolen funds. Courtney tried to shrink back into her plush leather chair, attempting to make herself entirely invisible. I pressed the silver remote again. Her pristine trust fund disbursement ledger appeared on the massive screen in bright, glaring colors. I showed the room exactly how her exorbitant monthly shopping allowances, her luxury downtown apartment rent, and her elite country club fees were directly funded by the high-interest predatory loans Richard had blindly signed. I explained that she had been living on toxic borrowed money for the last 5 years. Her entire influencer lifestyle, her flawless designer wardrobe, and her curated social media presence were entirely financed by an anonymous creditor who was now standing directly in front of her. I walked back to my open leather briefcase sitting on the polished mahogany table. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, heavy stack of master promissory notes Mr. Harrison had printed for me earlier that morning. I held the dense legal contracts high in the air, letting the stark reality of the physical documents sink into their panicked minds. I told them that the anonymous offshore proxy firm that had funded their entire fraudulent existence over the last decade was not a faceless international corporate entity. It was Beatrice. She had actively weaponized her wealth and intentionally purchased every single ounce of their toxic failing debt. She owned the mortgages on the Fairfield Marble Mansion, the titles to Gavin luxury sports cars, the deed to Courtney apartment, and the absolute entirety of Richard failing logistics firm. I slapped the heavy stack of debt notes onto the center of the boardroom table. The loud sound cracked through the silent room like a gunshot, making Catherine physically flinch. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the contracts, and looked directly into my father's terrified, wide eyes. I told him that as the sole rightful heir to the Beatrice family trust, I was now the primary holder of those proxy firms. I was legally and officially his biggest, most dangerous creditor. I owned his entire life, his entire company, and his entire future. Mr. Sterling stepped forward smoothly, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He officially announced to the room that, acting as my lead corporate counsel, he was initiating the immediate execution of the default clauses explicitly outlined in the master promissory notes. My father firm had missed 3 consecutive quarterly interest payments, making the massive debt entirely callable upon immediate demand. I looked at the digital clock glowing in red numbers on the boardroom wall. It was exactly 10:45 in the morning. I turned my gaze back to my father and informed him that I was officially calling in the entirety of the corporate debt. I demanded immediate repayment in full. I stated with absolute cold finality that if the outstanding $32 million in leveraged corporate loans was not deposited directly into my highly secure holding accounts by exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon, I would execute a hostile total seizure of every single asset they possessed. They would be entirely, completely bankrupt before the sun went down. Complete, absolute pandemonium violently erupted inside the glass-walled boardroom. The fragile, toxic alliance that had bound my family together for decades shattered into a million jagged pieces in a matter of seconds. They instantly turned on each other like starved, rabid animals trapped in a burning cage. Gavin leaped out of his leather chair, violently shoving the heavy piece of furniture backward until it crashed against the wall. He screamed at Richard, his face contorted with intense panic and blind rage. He viciously accused our father of completely ruining his life and blatantly lying about the financial health of the logistics company. He shouted that he was going to federal prison because Richard had assured him the aggressive tax evasion and phantom vendor schemes were completely untraceable. He wildly waved his arms, declaring that he was going to testify against Richard to save his own skin the second the federal authorities walked through the door. Courtney jumped to her feet and directed her absolute furious wrath directly at Gavin. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, viciously attacking her brother for illegally siphoning corporate funds to buy stupid imported sports cars while she was now facing total catastrophic financial ruin. She screamed that Gavin's unchecked greed and massive gambling debts had rapidly accelerated the corporate default and permanently destroyed her flawless luxury lifestyle. She realized with terrifying clarity that her wealthy elite friends would instantly abandon her the second the news of the bankruptcy leaked to the public. She wailed that her entire social standing was dead and it was entirely their fault. Richard tried to desperately shout over the chaotic screaming, matching their volume with his own booming, panicked voice. He aggressively slammed his hands on the table, commanding them to shut up and listen to his authority. He wildly promised he could fix this massive disaster, claiming he just needed a little more time to liquidate some hidden offshore assets to cover the immediate margin call. He pleaded with his children to remain united and fight me in court. But the damning evidence glowing brightly on the massive projection screen directly behind him rendered his desperate promises entirely hollow. They all knew the terrifying, inescapable truth. The money was completely gone. The luxury cars, the elite country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the absolute unearned arrogance were officially dead. They were totally, completely broke. Catherine sat frozen in her chair, completely ignoring the vicious screaming match echoing violently around her. She stared blankly at the shredded pieces of the $8 million checks sitting on the table, and then slowly looked up at the overwhelming forensic data projected on the wall. The horrifying absolute finality of the situation finally crashed through her heavy layers of aristocratic denial. The pristine, flawless image she had ruthlessly maintained her entire life was entirely destroyed. She realized with suffocating clarity that the Fairfield Marble Mansion was gone. The lavish catered dinner parties were gone. The expensive vintage Chanel dresses and the exotic crocodile skin handbags were gone. Her entire identity as a wealthy, elite socialite was instantly eradicated. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged, gasping breaths that hitched painfully in her chest. Her perfectly styled hair fell loosely around her face as she suddenly dropped to the floor. The incredibly rare exotic handbag she had proudly flaunted earlier slipped from her lap and crashed onto the marble floor, completely ignored. Catherine crawled toward me on her hands and knees, her expensive dress bunching up awkwardly around her legs. She broke down into ugly, heavy, uncontrollable sobbing. Tears streamed rapidly down her face, completely ruining her perfect, flawless makeup. She grabbed the edge of my tailored suit jacket with shaking, desperate hands. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging me for mercy. She sobbed violently, crying out that they were going to be completely homeless by the end of the week. She pleaded with me to stop the foreclosure, begging me to remember that she was my mother and that family was supposed to protect each other. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, broken woman clutching my jacket. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, and no lingering desire for her maternal affection. The decades of severe psychological abuse had completely permanently killed any love I might have once held for her. I reached down and firmly pried her shaking hands off my gray suit jacket, letting her fall back onto the cold, polished marble floor. I looked down at her tear-stained, terrified face and delivered the final, absolute, devastating blow. You called me a glorified bookkeeper. You were right. I kept the books, and your accounts are empty. I snapped the twin brass clasps of my leather briefcase shut and turned my back on the pathetic scene playing out on the boardroom floor. Mr. Sterling seamlessly fell into step beside me as we walked out the heavy glass doors. The muffled sounds of Catherine hyperventilating and Richard violently cursing echoed down the polished marble corridor, but I did not look back a single time. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor in comfortable, absolute silence. Stepping out of the towering glass skyscraper, the freezing winter air hit my face, and I took a massive deep breath. It tasted like absolute pure freedom. The fallout over the next 30 days moved with the terrifying, unstoppable speed of a Category 5 hurricane. I watched the total systematic dismantling of my fabricated empire from the safety of my new executive suite. Exactly as the federal agent had promised, heavily armed financial regulators swarmed the logistics corporate headquarters before noon that very same Friday. Local news helicopters captured high-definition footage of stern federal agents carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes filled with doctored hard drives and physical ledgers right out the front doors. Richard was completely paralyzed. His aggressive legal team instantly dropped him the second his operating accounts were officially frozen by the federal court. He was publicly escorted out of his own lobby in silver handcuffs, his custom-tailored pinstripe suit looking wrinkled and pathetic under the harsh glare of the media cameras. The massive tax evasion and wire fraud charges carried a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. His entire life was permanently over. Gavin experienced a completely different but equally devastating brand of utter humiliation. Without the massive illegal offshore corporate subsidies secretly funding his lavish lifestyle, his entire fraudulent reality evaporated literally overnight. Federal marshals arrived at his upscale downtown condominium with a stack of seizure warrants. I received the official liquidation reports detailing exactly how his three imported luxury sports cars were aggressively towed right out of his private VIP parking garage, while his elite wealthy neighbors watched and openly gossiped. My brother, who had never worked a single honest day in his entire parasitic life, was forcefully evicted and legally mandated to file for total Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The local business journals published articles detailing his catastrophic downfall, featuring a photograph of him leaving the bankruptcy court looking completely disheveled, sobbing and holding a meager plastic bag of his remaining personal possessions. He had demanded I wash his car. Now he did not even own a bicycle. Courtney catastrophic implosion was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. The very second the federal indictments against our father hit the major news networks, her wealthy elite husband instantly moved to ruthlessly protect his own inherited assets. He was deeply terrified that the federal regulators would aggressively audit his personal accounts by proximity to her toxic family name. He locked Courtney entirely out of their sprawling luxury penthouse, canceled all her platinum credit cards, and formally served her with emergency divorce papers before the weekend was even over. He cited a deeply buried, highly restrictive morality clause in their ironclad prenuptial agreement, effectively leaving her with absolutely nothing. She lost the designer clothes, the exclusive country club memberships, and the wealthy social circle she had viciously guarded. She was completely discarded by the very elite society she had worshipped her entire miserable life. But the absolute ultimate punishment fell directly onto Catherine. As the primary collateral on Richard's massive defaulted loans, the sprawling 8-bedroom Fairfield marble mansion was immediately legally seized by my offshore trust. I instructed my property management team to forcefully evict her, giving her exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises with only the clothes she could physically carry. Without Richard's stolen millions shielding her from reality, my mother was violently shoved into the exact same poverty she had relentlessly mocked me for enduring. The liquidation agents tracked her downward spiral. She was ultimately forced to sign a lease on a tiny, cramped, mold-infested studio apartment located directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat in the worst industrial sector of the city. The linoleum floors were peeling, the radiator hissed violently throughout the night, and the single window looked out onto a brick alleyway filled with overflowing dumpsters. It was the exact type of modest, struggling environment she had spent 3 decades cruelly laughing at. She was finally living the pathetic, desperate life she had always insisted I deserved. As their respective worlds violently collapsed, my phone began lighting up with a relentless, desperate barrage of incoming calls. The toxic, aggressive superiority they had displayed in the boardroom was completely gone, entirely replaced by pathetic, sickening desperation. I sat at my large mahogany desk, watching the screen flash with their names. I did not answer a single call. Instead, I let them pile up in my voicemail inbox. On the 31st day, I finally sat back, poured myself a hot cup of black coffee, and pressed play. Richard was first. His loud, booming voice was entirely shattered, reduced to a wet, pathetic wheeze. He violently sobbed into the receiver, begging me to authorize a release of just $50,000 to pay for a low-level criminal defense attorney. He swore he would do anything I wanted, claiming he was a sick old man who would surely die in a federal penitentiary. Next was Gavin, crying so hard he could barely form a coherent sentence. He begged for a tiny fraction of the $32 million, claiming he was currently sleeping on a dirty mattress in a friend basement and could not afford to buy basic groceries. Courtney voicemail was a hysterical, shrieking mess. She wailed that she was forced to ride the public city bus surrounded by poor people and demanded I send her money to rent a decent apartment because she was too pretty to live like a common peasant. Finally, Catherine. Her message was a long, pathetic, rambling stream of pure manipulation. She cried about the loud noises and the pervasive smell of mold in her studio apartment. She begged me to remember the good times, invoking her maternal status, and claiming she had always secretly loved me the most. She pleaded for a second chance, promising she would be the perfect mother if I just bought her a small, modest condo in a respectable neighborhood. I sat perfectly still, letting their weeping, pathetic voices fill my quiet office. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to rescue them. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical closure. They were strangers to me now. Their suffering was the direct mathematical result of their own unchecked, vicious cruelty. I picked up my phone, tapped the screen, and highlighted every single message. I pressed the delete button, wiping their pathetic, groveling voices from my device entirely. Then I opened my contact list and permanently blocked every single one of their numbers. I completely erased them from my existence. 1 year later, the brutal winter had faded into a bright, brilliant spring. I stood proudly in the center of the massive, beautifully restored lobby of my newest corporate venture. I had completely liquidated Richard's corrupt logistics firm and used the massive recovered capital to build something real. The Beatrice Financial Advocacy Center was a massive nonprofit organization entirely dedicated to providing elite legal and financial auditing services to elderly victims of corporate and familial fraud. The lobby was breathtaking, featuring soaring vaulted ceilings, bright natural light pouring through massive skylights, and polished white marble floors. I was not alone. The grand opening reception was in full swing, and the massive room was filled with the sound of genuine happy laughter and clinking champagne glasses. I was entirely surrounded by my newfound family. Mr. Harrison stood by the catering table, warmly introducing his wife to my newly hired team of brilliant young forensic auditors. Mr. Sterling was engaged in a deep, animated conversation with our lead litigator, plotting out our next major legal strike against a corrupt regional banking firm. They respected me. They valued my sharp intellect, my unyielding work ethic, and my fierce dedication to the truth. I was no longer the defective, broken scapegoat cowering in the shadows of a toxic household. I was a respected, powerful CEO standing at the absolute center of an empire I had built with my own two hands. I excused myself from the lively celebration and walked quietly down the bright corridor toward my private executive suite. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped into the quiet, calm space. The room was perfectly tailored to my exact specifications, with a massive, sleek desk and comfortable modern seating. But the absolute most important piece in the room hung directly behind my desk, illuminated by a soft, warm spotlight. It was a beautiful, highly detailed watercolor portrait of my grandmother Beatrice. She was smiling that sharp, knowing, brilliant smile that had always made me feel completely invincible. I walked over and gently touched the gold frame. I had successfully transformed a lifetime of suffocating victimhood into a massive, undeniable empire. I had systematically destroyed the monsters who had tried to break me, and I had used their stolen resources to build a fortress of absolute protection. I looked at Beatrice's smiling face and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle deep into my bones. True, absolute wealth was not defined by offshore bank accounts or luxury sports cars or sprawling marble mansions. True wealth was possessing the absolute unyielding power to walk away from toxic, poisonous people and never, ever look back.